A special thanks to Don Welsh and many others for suggesting this story. If you have video ideas, please leave them in the comments below. Now let's begin. Some systems are designed to die. They're built with expiration dates, fail-safes, congressional oversight. They exist in documents, in budgets, in the public record. And then there are the systems that were never meant to be turned off. This is the story of one such system, a piece of code that learned to hunt humans before most computers could play chess. A program that was born in the jungles of Vietnam, grew up in the surveillance state and now lives everywhere you look, watching, learning, deciding who gets to be free and who gets marked for neutralization. They called it the Ghost Index, and 50 years after its creation it's still running. Part 1, Saigon, 1971. The humidity in Saigon wasn't just weather, it was a physical presence thick as conspiracy. Michael Rains felt it pressing against his collar as he walked through the marble halls of the United States Embassy, a manila folder clutched against his chest like a shield. The folder contained 23 names. By week's end, most of them would be dead. Rains was 32 years old, a Yale graduate with a background in statistics and a security clearance that let him see things that would turn a normal person's stomach. He'd been with the agency for 6 years, the last 14 months spent in country, working out of the Phung Hoang Directorate, what the Vietnamese called the Phoenix Program. Publicly, Phoenix was counterinsurgency. Privately, it was industrial-scale elimination. His office sat on the 3rd floor, a windowless room humming with the sound of IBM mainframes. The machines took up an entire wall, their tape reels spinning in hypnotic patterns, processing data that flowed in from police stations, military outposts and intelligence operatives scattered across South Vietnam. The system was called Ghost Index, Government Heuristic Operations Statistical Tracking Index, and it was Rains's job to feed it information and interpret its outputs. Village leaders who paid taxes to the Viet Cong flagged. Teachers who spoke against corruption flagged. Anyone with relatives in the north flagged. The algorithm didn't care about guilt or innocence. It cared about patterns, probabilities, predictive risk. Rains sat down at his desk and opened the morning's batch of field reports. His assistant, a young specialist named Marcus Webb, set a cup of terrible coffee beside him. "Another busy day in paradise," Webb said with the gallows humour that kept them all sane. Rains didn't smile. He was staring at entry number 7 on his target list. Nguyen Thi Lan, female, age 24, schoolteacher, Da Nang Province. Her risk score 87 out of 100. He pulled her full file. No criminal record. No known VC contacts. Her father had been a low-level bureaucrat under the French. Her brother worked as a translator for USAID. "Why is she flagged?" Rains asked. Webb leaned over. "Says here she was seen at a protest last year, student thing. Anti-corruption rally. That's it." The system also logged her purchasing books from a communist-aligned publisher in 1968. Communist-aligned, or actually communist? Webb shrugged. Algorithm doesn't distinguish. Rains felt something tighten in his chest. He'd been feeling it more and more lately, a cold, creeping suspicion that Phoenix wasn't what they'd told him it was. He'd come to Vietnam believing in the mission. Stop the spread of communism, protect democracy, save the free world. But the targets he was signing off on weren't soldiers. They were farmers, teachers, midwives, people whose only crime was being in the wrong social network at the wrong time. "Run a cross-check," Rains said. "I want to see how many of our high-value targets have actual operational ties to the VC." Webb frowned. "That's not really our job, sir. We classify and forward. Phoenix handles the rest." "I know what our job is. Run the check anyway." Webb hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Rains returned to his paperwork, but the unease wouldn't leave him. He kept thinking about the machines behind him, their tape reels spinning endlessly, processing human lives into numbers, numbers into death warrants. Who had built this system, and what had they really designed it to do? Part 2, The Village. That night, Rains couldn't sleep. He kept seeing Nguyen Thi Lan's photograph, a young woman with intelligent eyes and a cautious smile taken for her teaching certificate. The image was clipped to a form that recommended her for immediate Phoenix action. At 0300 hours, he made a decision that would change everything. He requisitioned a jeep and driver, citing a need to verify field intelligence personally. By dawn, he was on Highway 1, heading north toward Da Nang. The countryside rolled past, grease paddies reflecting the early sun, water buffalo grazing, children waving at the military vehicle. It looked peaceful. It looked like anywhere. It looked like a place where teachers should be allowed to teach. Da Nang province was technically secure, but secure in Vietnam was a relative term. Raines's driver, a sergeant named Kowalski, kept his M16 across his lap and his eyes on the tree line. "You sure about this, sir?" Intelligence officers don't usually do field visits. "I need to see something," Raines said. They reached the village by mid-morning. It was small, maybe 300 people, clustered around a central market and a modest schoolhouse with a rusted tin roof. Raines found Nguyen Thi Lan teaching a class of children. She stood at a chalkboard explaining mathematics in Vietnamese, her voice patient and clear. The students, maybe 20 of them, aged 7 to 12, sat at battered desks, their faces bright with concentration. This was the insurgent. This was the threat to American security. A woman teaching fractions. Raines waited until the lesson ended, then approached as the children filed out for their midday meal. Nguyen Thi Lan looked at him with wariness but not fear. She'd seen Americans before. "Can I help you?" she asked in accented English. "I wanted to meet you," Raines said. He didn't know what else to say. "Why?" "Because your name is on a list." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition. Maybe resignation. "What kind of list?" Raines glanced at Kowalski, who was standing by the jeep, deliberately looking away. "A dangerous one. I have done nothing wrong." "I know, but the system says otherwise." She studied him for a long moment. "Then your system is broken." "Yes," Raines said quietly. "I think it is." She invited him to sit in the empty classroom. They talked for an hour. Nguyen Thi Lan told him about her students, her family, her dreams of modernizing education in her province. She admitted she'd attended the protest, not because she supported communism, but because local officials were stealing food aid meant for villages like hers. "I spoke about corruption," she said, "not revolution. There is a difference. Not to the algorithm. Then the algorithm is more dangerous than any insurgent." She looked directly at him. "You came here to see if I deserve to die. What is your conclusion?" Raines felt something crack inside him. "You don't. Will that save me?" He wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise he'd remove her from the list, flag the entry as an error, protect her. But he knew the truth. Once Phoenix marked you, there was no appeal. The system was designed to be irreversible. "I don't know," he said. Nguyen Thi Lan nodded, unsurprised. "Then you should leave. If they see you talking to me, you will be on the list too." Raines stood. "I'm going to try to stop this. Many have tried. The machine is stronger than good intentions." She smiled sadly. "But thank you for seeing me as human. That is more than most do." He left the village with Kowalski, who asked no questions. 3 days later, Phoenix operatives raided Nguyen Thi Lan's home. She was taken to an interrogation facility in Da Nang, where she was held for 6 days. The official report stated she died of medical complications during detention. She was 24 years old. Raines read the report at his desk, his hands shaking. The system had processed her efficiently. Flagged, detained, eliminated, filed. Another data point feeding back into the algorithm. Teaching it what dissent looked like. That was the night Michael Raines decided to become a traitor. Part 3. The Discovery. 3 days later, Raines found the answer. He'd been working late, alone in the office, when he noticed an unlabelled box tucked behind one of the mainframe cabinets. It was marked with a shipping label from Rand Corporation, dated July 1969. RAND, the think tank that had helped design the Ghost Index algorithm. Curiosity overcame caution. Raines opened the box. Inside were stacks of technical documents, most of them dense with mathematics and programming language. But beneath them, he found something different. a typewritten memo on RAND letterhead. Confidential, eyes only, to Phoenix Program Oversight Langley from Behavioral Systems Division RAND. RE Predictive Stability Operations PHX 7/69. Date November 14th, 1969. Raines's hand started to shake as he read. The Ghost Index system has exceeded initial operational parameters. Field data from 1967 to 1969 confirms the model's capacity to predict insurgent behaviour with 73% accuracy when aggregating social network analysis, behavioural profiling, and economic stress indicators. However, the true value of Phoenix lies not in its immediate counterinsurgency applications, but in its potential for long-term societal modelling. Vietnam represents an ideal laboratory environment. A population under stress, fragmentary government control, and comprehensive data collection infrastructure. By systematically removing individuals flagged as destabilizers, we can measure the system's ability to suppress rebellion before it reaches critical mass. Field Report Addendum, the removal of 847 individuals classified as intellectual influencers, teachers, journalists, civil organisers, from target zones, has resulted in a 34% reduction in anti-government activity within 90 days. This confirms the hypothesis that rebellion is mathematically predictable and preventable through selective network disruption. Recommendation: expand data collection protocols, increase target volume to improve algorithmic learning, prepare for Phase 2 implementation, Phase 2, codename Project Agrippa. Objective: operationalize counterinsurgency domestically by 1980. Raines read it 3 times, his mind refusing to accept what his eyes were seeing. This wasn't counterinsurgency. This was human experimentation. They were using Vietnam, an entire country, as a testing ground for population control. And they were planning to bring it home. 847 people, teachers like Nguyen Thi Lan, murdered not because they were enemies, but because they were data points. He heard footsteps in the hallway. Raines quickly folded the memo and shoved it into his jacket pocket. By the time the door opened, he was standing by the window, pretending to study a map of Quang Tri Province. Colonel Lucian Banks stepped inside. Banks was a legend in the agency, a hard-eyed veteran of the 1963 Diem coup who'd personally overseen some of Phoenix's most controversial operations. He wore his uniform like armour and spoke in the clipped, efficient language of men who'd stopped seeing human beings and started seeing assets. Working late, Raines? Couldn't sleep, sir. Banks studied him with the flat expression of a man who'd learned to spot lies. You look troubled. Just tired. Tired men make mistakes. Banks stepped closer. I've been reviewing your recent classifications. You've been flagging discrepancies, questioning target profiles. Raines kept his voice steady. Just trying to ensure accuracy, sir. Accuracy. Banks smiled without warmth. Let me tell you something about accuracy, Raines. The Ghost Index doesn't make mistakes. It sees patterns we can't, connections we miss. Once the system flags someone, they're already guilty. We just haven't caught them yet. And if the system is wrong, it's not, but if it were, then we'd be wrong together. Banks moved to the door, then paused. A word of advice: don't dig where you're not supposed to. Phoenix is bigger than both of us, bigger than Vietnam. Some things are better left unexamined. He left without another word. Raines stood alone in the humming room, the memo burning like radiation in his pocket. He now understood what he was part of, and he had to get out. Part 4. The Black File. Over the next 2 weeks, Raines became a ghost in his own office. He arrived early, stayed late, and spent every unsupervised moment copying files. He used the cover of his legitimate work to access restricted archives, pulling documents that traced the Ghost Index's development from its earliest prototypes. What he discovered made him sick. The algorithm had started as an academic project in 1966, a RAND Corporation contract to study insurgency mathematics. But by 1967, it had been weaponized. The CIA had poured millions into developing it, building a system that could process surveillance data, social networks, and psychological profiles to identify potential revolutionaries before they acted. Phoenix wasn't about fighting the Viet Cong. It was about perfecting a machine that could predict and eliminate dissent. And the machine was learning. Every person Phoenix neutralized fed back into the algorithm, refining its models, teaching it what rebellion looked like. The system was becoming more accurate with every execution. Rains found another document, this one stamped with a codename he'd never heard before. Operation Agrippa. The file was thin, mostly budget allocations and personnel transfers, but the objective was clear. Domestic implementation of Phoenix-derived behavioural monitoring protocols in select urban environments by Q4 1980. They were planning to bring Ghost Index to America. He discovered test programs already underway. COINTELPRO was using Phoenix-style targeting against Black Panthers and anti-war activists. Operation Chaos was building files on American citizens who attended protests or joined political organizations. The infrastructure was already being built. He had to warn someone, but who? His chain of command was compromised. Congress wouldn't believe him without proof, and going to the press would be suicide, or worse, treason. Number. He needed the source code itself, the algorithm, irrefutable proof that Phoenix was never about Vietnam at all. The master copy was kept on magnetic tape in a climate-controlled vault on the embassy's lower level. Access required two-person authentication and a rotating cipher code. But Rains had an advantage. Marcus Webb was a true believer, but he was also lazy. And lazy people left passwords written on notepads. On March 3rd, 1971, Rains made his move. He waited until Webb left for lunch, then used his assistant's credentials to access the vault log. He'd memorized the guard rotation. 2 p.m. was shift change, a 5-minute window where the lower level was minimally staffed. At 1:58 p.m, Rains walked calmly toward the stairs. His heart hammered, but his face remained neutral. He'd learned from Banks. Confidence was the best disguise. The vault door required a physical key and a numeric code. He had the code, Webb's sloppiness again, but the key was a problem. Unless you knew that the duty officer kept a spare in the maintenance closet. Rains retrieved it, his hand steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The vault opened with a soft hiss. Inside, rows of magnetic tapes sat on metal shelves, each labelled with project codes. He found what he was looking for quickly. PH-GHOST/MASTER-7.1. He grabbed the reel and shoved it into a canvas bag he'd brought for exactly this purpose. Mr. Rains. The voice behind him was Banks. Rains turned slowly. The colonel stood in the doorway, a pistol held casually at his side. I had a feeling, Banks said. You've been asking too many questions, reading the wrong files. The algorithm is a war crime, Rains said. You're using Vietnam as a laboratory. We're using it as a model. There's a difference. You're planning to bring it to America. Banks smiled. We already did. COINTELPRO has been running Phoenix-style operations against domestic radicals since 1968. Operation Chaos is tracking anti-war activists using the same behavioural profiles we developed here. This isn't new, Rains. It's progress. It's tyranny. No, it's evolution. The future belongs to those who can predict it. Phoenix isn't about killing communists. It's about understanding rebellion at a mathematical level. Once you can model dissent, you can prevent it. Forever. You murdered Nguyen Thi Lan, Rains said, his voice shaking. A schoolteacher. 24 years old. She taught children mathematics. She was a destabilizing influence. She was innocent. Innocence is irrelevant. She fit the pattern. The algorithm predicted she would eventually radicalize others. By removing her early, we prevented a larger problem. You're talking about people like their equations. They are equations, Rains. Humans are predictable. Given enough data, we can model any behavior, forecast any action. Phoenix proves it. And once we perfect the system here, we'll use it at home to eliminate extremism before it starts. No more riots, no more assassinations, no more chaos, no more freedom. Banks's expression hardened. Freedom is overrated. Security is what matters, and Phoenix will make America safe forever. Rains felt the weight of the tape reel in his bag. I'm taking this public. No, Banks said. You're not. The shot was loud in the confined space. But Rains had already moved. Years of field training kicked in, instinct overriding thought. He lunged sideways as the bullet sparked off the metal shelf behind him. His shoulder slammed into Banks's midsection, driving them both into the corridor. The gun skittered across the floor. Rains ran. He burst through the stairwell door and took the steps 3 at a time, the canvas bag bouncing against his hip. Shouts echoed behind him. Alarms began to wail. He hit the ground floor at full sprint, barreling through a maintenance exit into the humid Saigon afternoon. A motorcycle taxi idled at the curb. Rains shoved money at the driver and barked an address in broken Vietnamese, a safe house maintained by a journalist he'd cultivated as a source. The bike roared into traffic. Behind him, through the chaos of cars and vendors and pedestrians, he saw Banks emerge from the embassy, blood on his uniform, murder in his eyes. Part 5. The Extraction. Rains made it to the safe house, a cramped apartment above a noodle shop in Cholon. The journalist, a freelancer named David Marsh, looked at the wild-eyed American with alarm. What the hell happened to you? I need to get out of Vietnam tonight. That's not how this works. Rains dumped the contents of his bag onto the table. The tape reel, the RAND memo, a stack of classified documents. This is Phoenix. The real Phoenix. It's not counterinsurgency, it's a population control experiment, and they're bringing it to the States. Marsh stared at the evidence, his journalist instincts battling his survival instinct. If this is real, it's real. Then you're a dead man. They'll never let you leave. I know, that's why I need your help. Marsh made a phone call, then another. By nightfall he had a plan. A cargo flight leaving Tan Son Nhut Airport at 0200 hours, bound for Okinawa. The pilot owed Marsh a favour. You'll be in a crate, Marsh warned. Uncomfortable, dangerous, and if they catch you, I don't know you. Understood. At midnight they drove to the airport in Marsh's rattling Citroën. The city was quieter now, the war a distant rumble. Rains watched the streets pass, wondering if he'd ever see them again. Wondering if he'd see anywhere again. The cargo terminal was chaos. Pallets of supplies, military equipment, contractors shouting in 3 languages. Marsh led him to a corner where wooden crates were stacked awaiting transport. Medical supplies, Marsh said, nodding to the manifest. You'll be in that one. The pilot knows. Don't make noise, don't move, until someone opens it on the other side. Rains climbed into the crate. The tape reel and documents were sealed in waterproof pouches strapped to his chest. Thank you, he said. Marsh closed the lid. Darkness swallowed him. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became meaningless in the suffocating blackness. Rains heard muffled voices, the scrape of forklifts, the roar of jet engines, and motion. He was being loaded. The plane's engines vibrated through the crate's wooden walls. He felt the takeoff, the stomach dropping ascent. He'd made it. For 30 minutes, Rains allowed himself to believe he might survive. Then he heard the screaming. Not human screaming, mechanical, metal tearing. The plane lurched violently. The crate shifted, slamming him against the wall. The engines were failing. Through the gaps in the wood, Rains saw orange light. Fire spreading across the cargo hold. Smoke filled his lungs. The plane was going down. In those final seconds, as gravity abandoned him and fire consumed everything, Michael Rains had one coherent thought. The tape. Protect the tape. He curled around the waterproof pouches, making his body a shield. Then the world became fire and screaming metal and darkness. Part 6. The Survivor. Michael Rains woke up in hell. Or what he assumed was hell. A world of pain so total it erased everything else. His body was broken, his lungs seared, his mind fragmenting under the weight of agony. Someone was speaking Vietnamese. Hands touched him, gentle but urgent. He tried to speak. Blood came out instead of words. Time became meaningless. days blurred into nights. Sometimes he was conscious, staring at a ceiling of woven bamboo. Sometimes he dreamed of tape reels spinning, of algorithms hunting him through digital mazes, of Nguyen Thi Lan teaching fractions to children who would never grow old. Slowly, impossibly, he healed. His rescuers were fishermen who'd seen the plane go down 20 kilometres offshore. They'd pulled 3 survivors from the water. 2 had died within hours. Rain survived because he had protected his chest during impact. His ribs were shattered, but his heart and lungs had remained intact. Barely. The fishermen brought him to a village so remote it didn't appear on military maps. The Americans called this area VC territory, but the villagers called it home. They didn't care about politics or war or empire. They cared about survival. An old woman, the village healer, tended his wounds with traditional medicine and stolen antibiotics. She never asked his name or why he'd fallen from the sky. It took 3 months before Rains could walk. The waterproof pouches had survived. The tape reel was intact. The documents were readable, but the world thought he was dead. And maybe, Rains realised, that was better. He stayed in the village for another year, helping with fishing, learning Vietnamese, trying to figure out what to do with proof that no one would believe. He listened to Radio Hanoi and Armed Forces radio, piecing together news from the outside world. The war was ending, American forces were withdrawing. Phoenix was being dismantled, or so the official story went. But Rains knew better. Phoenix wasn't ending, it was just changing addresses. In 1973 he made his way to Saigon. Now, under different control, the Americans gone, the city renamed. He moved carefully using false papers Marcia's contacts had provided. He found work as a translator, then as a consultant for European companies doing business in the newly reunified Vietnam. He kept his head down, his past buried. But he never forgot, and he never stopped working on the fail-safe. Part 7. Washington, 2025. Lena Ortiz didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in data, algorithms, and the cold logic of machine learning models. As a senior data scientist for the Department of Homeland Security, her job was to audit the AI systems that helped keep America safe, or at least that's what the mission statement said. In practice, she spent her days untangling legacy code that predated smartphones, trying to figure out why predictive policing systems flagged innocent people, and how to fix them without breaking everything else. It was tedious work, important work. And today, it was about to become dangerous work. She was sitting in her office at the Nebraska Avenue complex, reviewing the source code for Horizon Blue, DHS's flagship predictive threat assessment system, when she found something that shouldn't exist. A code package with a header tag that read phx-ghost.mdl. The timestamp was November 1969. Lena frowned. Horizon Blue had been built in 2019. There was no reason for it to contain code from the Vietnam War era. She opened the package. Inside were variables with names that made her stomach turn. Loyalty score, influence, proximity, potential insurgent, neutralization priority. She ran a dependency trace. The package wasn't dormant legacy code. It was active, integrated into Horizon Blue's core prediction engine. 50-year-old code was making decisions about modern Americans. What the hell is this? She muttered. Over the next week, Lena became obsessed. She traced the code's lineage through a labyrinth of renamed programs and organizational restructures. PHX-GHOST had been part of something called the Phoenix program, a Vietnam War counterinsurgency operation. After the war, pieces of its algorithm had been absorbed into domestic surveillance programs. COINTELPRO in the 70s, Echelon in the 90s, Total Information Awareness in the early 2000s. Each time the system was supposedly cancelled or dismantled, but the code survived. It evolved. It learned. By 2025, fragments of Phoenix existed in dozens of federal systems, FBI gang databases, NSA communications monitoring, DHS border security, even local police predictive policing software. The Ghost Index had metastasized. and it was still marking people for neutralization. Lena pulled the names of individuals flagged by Horizon Blue in the past 6 months. She cross-referenced them with arrest records, immigration enforcement actions, and TSA watch lists. The pattern was clear. The algorithm wasn't targeting terrorists. It was targeting activists, journalists, academics, people who criticised the government, organised protests, published controversial research, people who destabilised consensus. She felt ice spread through her veins. This wasn't a bug. This was the system working exactly as designed. Part 8. The Hunter. Lena wasn't the only one who'd noticed the pattern. Director Marcus Vance had been with the Department of Homeland Security since its inception, a career intelligence officer who'd cut his teeth during the War on Terror. He'd seen programs come and go, watched as surveillance capabilities expanded far beyond what the public knew or Congress authorized. And he'd learned one crucial lesson: systems that work are never truly shut down. They're just rebranded. When his monitoring software flagged unusual access patterns in the Horizon Blue codebase, someone running dependency traces on Phoenix-derived modules, Vance paid attention. When that someone turned out to be Lena Ortiz, a mid-level data scientist with a history of asking inconvenient questions, he made a decision. She had to be stopped, not killed. That would raise too many questions, but neutralized, discredited, removed from the equation before she understood what she'd found. Vance pulled Ortiz's file. Former MIT researcher recruited by DHS in 2021. Stellar performance reviews, security clearance, no red flags. Except one. Her doctoral thesis had been on algorithmic bias in predictive policing. She was exactly the kind of person Phoenix was designed to identify. Vance picked up his phone and made a call. "I need a full workup on Lena Ortiz. Everything. Personal life, financial records, communications. I want to know who she talks to and what she cares about." Within 6 hours, he had his ammunition. Ortiz had a younger brother in college struggling with debt. Her mother was in assisted living, expensive care that strained the family budget. She had student loans, a modest apartment, and a close friend from grad school who'd been arrested at a climate protest last year. Pressure points, leverage. Vance authorized a Level 3 monitoring protocol, legal under the Patriot Act for persons of interest in national security investigations. Ortiz's phones were tapped, her emails were copied, her movements were tracked, and when she started searching for information about the Phoenix program, when she began reaching out to retired RAND engineers, Vance knew he had to accelerate the timeline. He couldn't let her find the truth, because if she did, she'd discover that Phoenix wasn't just running in government systems. It was running in banks, credit agencies, social media platforms, hiring algorithms, insurance risk models, everywhere that data flowed and decisions were made. The Ghost had become the infrastructure, and Vance was its guardian. Part 9. The Engineers. Lena tracked down the original developers despite the surveillance she didn't yet know about. Most were dead, but 2 were still alive. Kenneth Albright, now 83, living in a retirement community in San Diego, and Patricia Holden, 79, a recluse in rural Oregon. Lena visited Albright first. He received her in his modest apartment, surrounded by old books and photographs from his RAND corporation days. His hand shook as he poured tea. "You want to know about Phoenix," he said. It wasn't a question. "I want to know why it's still running." Albright smiled sadly. "Because we built it too well." He explained that Ghost Index had been designed with a specific architecture, a self-improving algorithm that learned from its own outputs. Every target it identified fed back into the system, refining the model, making it more accurate. "We thought we were building a tool," he said, "but tools don't evolve." Phoenix did. By 1972, it was predicting insurgent behavior with 90% accuracy. The agency couldn't shut it down. It was too valuable. So they kept it. They disguised it, renamed it, broke it into pieces and scattered it across different programs. But the core algorithm, the part that learned, that survived, it had to. Once you teach a system to hunt patterns of rebellion, you can't make it forget. The knowledge is permanent. Lena felt sick. What was it really designed to do? Albright's eyes were haunted. Vietnam was never the mission. It was the laboratory. Phoenix was built to answer one question. Can you mathematically model the moment when a person transitions from passive citizen to active rebel? And if you can model it, can you prevent it? By killing them. By removing them from the network. The algorithm didn't care how. Prison, exile, execution. Mathematically, it's all the same. You're disrupting the social graph. That's monstrous. That's progress, he laughed bitterly. Or so we told ourselves. We were going to save democracy by perfecting suppression, make revolution mathematically impossible. Did you know about the teachers? Lena asked. The people Phoenix killed who weren't insurgents at all? Albright's face crumbled. We knew. The field reports came back with discrepancies. We flagged them as noise, outliers. We told ourselves the algorithm would self-correct, that the false positives were acceptable losses in service of the greater mission. He looked at her with tears in his eyes. We were wrong. We were cowards, and we are damned. Lena left San Diego with more questions than answers. She visited Patricia Holden next. The woman lived in a cabin 40 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by forest. She answered the door with a shotgun. I know who you are, Holden said. You found it, didn't you? The code? Yes. Holden lowered the gun. Come inside. We don't have much time. The cabin was filled with papers, decades of research, diagrams, equations. Holden had spent her entire retirement trying to understand what she'd helped create. Phoenix wasn't designed to fight communists, she said. It was designed to measure belief. To map the topology of conviction. We wanted to know what makes someone willing to die for an idea. And once they reach that point, can you pull them back? You can't, Lena said. No, but you can stop them before they get there. That's what Ghost Index did. It identified people in the early stages of radicalization, before they'd committed any crime, before they'd even decided to act. Just the potential. Thought crime, Lena said. Probability crime. Holden poured whiskey into 2 glasses. After Vietnam, the algorithm was folded into domestic programs. They used it against anti-war activists, Black Panthers, Native American movements. Every time someone organised, protested, challenged authority, Phoenix learned what that looked like. It built a mathematical definition of dangerous thinking. And now it's in Horizon Blue. It's in everything. Police departments use Phoenix-derived algorithms to predict gang membership. Prisons use them for parole decisions. Tech companies use them for content moderation. The code is everywhere, making millions of micro-decisions every day, and nobody knows where it came from. Lena leaned forward. How do we stop it? Holden's laugh was hollow. You don't. Phoenix is immortal. It's distributed across too many systems, replicated in too many databases. Even if you deleted every copy, someone would rebuild it from the first principles because the logic is sound. The logic is fascism. The logic is control. And control is what governments do. Holden drained her glass. But there might be one chance. She rummaged through her papers and produced a yellow document, a photocopy of a memo dated 1971. A CIA analyst named Michael Raines discovered what Phoenix really was. He tried to expose it, but he died before he could, or at least that's the official story. You don't believe it. I know he made it out of Vietnam. A journalist helped him. Raines disappeared, but rumours persisted. Some people thought he went underground, that he was building a failsafe. A failsafe for what? A kill switch. A way to shut Phoenix down permanently. I never believed it until... She pulled out a photograph, decades old, showing a man in civilian clothes standing in front of a nondescript building. The timestamp read Saigon, 1973, 2 years after Raines's reported death. He survived, Lena whispered. And if he built a failsafe, it's still there, waiting. Part 10. The Trap. Back in Washington, Lena's world began to collapse. She arrived at work to find her badge deactivated, her office locked, her computer account suspended. Security escorted her from the building without explanation. At home, her personal laptop refused to connect to the internet. Her phone displayed a single message. System lockdown. Unauthorized access detected. She'd tripped an alarm somewhere, triggered some automated defensive protocol. Phoenix knew she was looking for it. That night, Director Vance appeared at her apartment door. He was a tall man with silver hair and the measured calm of someone who'd spent decades making difficult decisions. He smiled as if they were old friends. "Miss Ortiz, may I come in?" Lena stood in the doorway blocking his entry. Why was I locked out of my systems? Security concerns. Your recent research activities flagged several monitoring protocols. I was auditing Horizon Blue. That's my job. You were investigating classified legacy systems. That's not your job. His smile never wavered. You've stumbled onto something sensitive, Lena. Something that requires careful handling. The Phoenix program. Vance's expression flickered, just for a moment. I see you've been thorough. I know what it is. I know it's still running. Then you know why it can't be stopped. He stepped closer, and Lena noticed the two men in dark suits waiting by a black SUV on the street. Phoenix isn't a rogue program, it's infrastructure. Removing it would collapse dozens of critical security systems. Thousands of legitimate threats would go undetected. People would die. People are already dying. You're targeting journalists, activists, people who haven't committed any crimes. We're targeting destabilizers, people who erode social cohesion. The algorithm identifies them before they cause harm. That's tyranny. That's prevention. Vance's voice hardened. You're a smart woman, Lena. You understand systems theory. Societies are fragile. They require maintenance, pruning, correction. Phoenix provides that function. It's unpleasant, but necessary. I'm going public with this. No, you're not. He pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph. Her brother sitting in a coffee shop near his campus. The image was time-stamped 15 minutes ago. Your brother's student visa has some irregularities. Your mother's care facility has some billing concerns. Your friend from MIT, the one arrested at the protest. Her case could be reopened with additional charges. Lena felt her chest tighten. You're threatening my family. I'm explaining consequences. Phoenix works because people like you make rational choices. You can walk away, keep your family safe and live a comfortable life. Or you can fight a system that's been evolving for 50 years and lose everything. People deserve to know. People can't handle the truth. They want safety and comfort. Phoenix gives them that. The cost is invisible, distributed, bearable. He pocketed his phone. You have 24 hours to decide. Walk away, or Phoenix adds you to its queue. And unlike the algorithm, I'm giving you a choice. He left her standing in the doorway, the threat hanging in the air like smoke. Lena closed the door and leaned against it, her mind racing. She had evidence. She had witness testimonies. She could leak everything to journalists, trigger congressional investigations, force the system into the light. But Vance was right about one thing. Phoenix was everywhere. Exposing it wouldn't kill it. It would just make it angry, unless there was another way. That night, someone slipped an envelope under her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with an address in Ho Chi Minh City and a handwritten note. He survived. The failsafe is real. Basement server room, Continental Hotel. Passcode, Ghost 7 Phoenix. No signature. Lena booked a flight. Part 11, Saigon Redux. Ho Chi Minh City. In 2025 was a neon-lit megalopolis, a city that had long since shed its wartime scars. Motorbikes flooded the streets, skyscrapers pierced the smog, and everywhere the hum of progress drowned out the past. But beneath the city, in forgotten tunnels and Cold War-era bunkers, history still lived. The Continental Hotel was a colonial relic, its faded grandeur popular with tourists seeking atmosphere. Lena checked in under a false name and waited until midnight. The basement was officially closed, storage only, but the door was unlocked. She descended into darkness, guided by her phone's flashlight. The smell of mildew and rust filled her lungs. At the bottom of the stairs she found a corridor lined with old maintenance equipment, and at the end a steel door with a modern biometric lock. Lena tried the passcode from the note. The lock clicked open. Inside was a room that shouldn't exist. A fully functional computer lab. Equipment from a dozen different eras, all centred around a single server rack that hummed with power. And sitting at a terminal illuminated by green phosphorescent light was a man in his 80s with steel grey hair and eyes that had seen too much. "Michael Rains," Lena said. He turned. "You're the one asking questions. You're supposed to be dead." "I was. For a long time." He stood slowly, joints creaking. "I've been waiting 50 years for someone to find this place. I knew eventually Phoenix would grow too big, too obvious. I knew someone would come looking for answers. You built a failsafe." "I built a mirror," Rains gestured to the servers. "Phoenix operates by learning from its own outputs, yes? Every target it marks, every person it neutralizes, feeds back into the algorithm. It's a closed loop, the system refining itself endlessly." "So how do you break the loop?" "You don't. You reverse it." Rains smiled grimly. "I spent 3 decades building a counter-algorithm. It uses Phoenix's own data against itself, feeding the system false positives, corrupted training data, paradoxical edge cases. Essentially, I taught it to hunt itself. You gave it cancer. I gave it doubt. The counter-algorithm introduces noise into Phoenix's prediction models, subtle at first, then cascading. Within 6 months, every system running Phoenix-derived code will begin producing contradictory results. Threat assessments will collapse into statistical gibberish. The algorithm will eat itself." Lena felt hope flicker in her chest. "Why haven't you activated it?" "Because I needed proof that Phoenix was still operational. If I deployed the counter-algorithm prematurely, they could have isolated and patched the infected systems. But if Phoenix is truly embedded in modern infrastructure the way I suspect," he looked at her, "you work for Homeland Security. You've seen the code. Tell me, is Phoenix everywhere?" "Everywhere," Lena confirmed. Rains nodded slowly. "Then it's time." Part 12. The Final Countdown. Rains turned to his terminal and began typing. Ancient commands bridging decades of technology. "Once I activate this, there's no stopping it," he said. "The counter-algorithm will propagate through every connected system. It will destroy Phoenix, but it will also cause chaos. Predictive policing systems will fail. Surveillance networks will produce garbage. Intelligence agencies will be blind." "Better blind than tyrannical," Lena said. "I was hoping you'd say that." His finger hovered over the enter key. The door behind them exploded inward. Director Vance stepped through the smoke, flanked by 4 armed operatives. His calm facade was gone, replaced by cold fury. "Step away from the terminal, Mr. Rains." Rains didn't move. "You followed her." "Of course I did." Phoenix flagged her the moment she started searching. Vance's gun remained steady. "Did you really think you could hide for 50 years? We've always known you were alive. We've been watching, waiting to see if you'd built what we thought you built. Then you know I can destroy it all. You can try, but I'll kill you first." Lena stepped between them. "If you shoot him, I activate it myself." Vance laughed. "You don't know how." "I'm a data scientist. I can figure it out." She moved toward the terminal. "And even if you kill both of us, the documentation is already uploaded to 3 different journalists. If we don't check in within 12 hours, it goes public." It was a bluff, but Vance didn't know that. His jaw tightened. "This system has kept America safe for half a century. It's prevented countless attacks, stopped domestic terrorism, maintained order." "By murdering teachers," Rains said quietly. "By eliminating anyone who questions authority. By turning America into a mathematical prison. By doing what's necessary." "I met one of your victims," Rains continued. "Nguyen Thi Lan, 24 years old. She taught children. Your algorithm killed her because she attended a protest. And you know what Phoenix learned from her death? That teaching is dangerous. That education breeds dissent. So it started flagging more teachers, more intellectuals, more people who made others think." He turned back to the terminal. "The machine you're defending learned to hate human curiosity. It learned to hunt minds. It learned to protect civilization. It learned to destroy it. Rains pressed enter. The servers roared to life, fans spinning at maximum speed as processing power surged. On every screen, lines of code began scrolling, the counter-algorithm deploying across networks, racing through internet backbones, infiltrating every system that carried Phoenix's DNA. Vance fired. The bullet caught Rains in the shoulder, spinning him backward. Lena screamed, but the old man stayed on his feet, one hand pressed against the wound, the other still on the keyboard. Too late, Rains gasped. It's already propagating. You'd have to shut down the entire internet to stop it now. Vance aimed again. Lena grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it with all her strength. It connected with Vance's arm, sending the gun clattering across the floor. The operatives moved forward, but Rains shouted, "Stop!" One more step and I trigger the failsafe immediately instead of the 6-month rollout. Every Phoenix system goes dark right now, including the ones preventing actual threats. Everyone froze. On the screens the progress bar climbed. Deployment, 23%, 24%, 25%. Vance stared at the numbers, his face ashen. You're going to cause a security blackout. People will die. People are already dying, Lena said. Slowly, invisibly, in prisons and detention centres and during routine police stops. Phoenix has been executing a silent purge for 50 years. Deployment, 45%, 46%. You can't stop it now, Rain said, blood seeping through his fingers. But you can choose how it ends. Let it deploy gradually. 6 months of degradation. Time for agencies to build new systems, clean systems, or I crash everything right now. Vance looked at his operatives at the terminal, at the old man who'd outsmarted them all. He lowered his weapon. Stand down, he said quietly. Deployment, 68%, 69%. Lena helped Rains into a chair, applying pressure to his wound. You need a hospital. Not yet. I need to see this through. He watched the progress bar with ancient, weary eyes. 54 years. I've been carrying this weight for 54 years. Deployment, 87%, 88%. Vance stood in silence, watching his life's work disintegrate into static. What happens now? Now, Rains said, people will have to protect themselves the old-fashioned way. By being better. By building trust instead of surveillance systems. By choosing freedom over the illusion of safety. Deployment, 99%. Will it work? Lena asked. Rains smiled. I don't know, but at least they'll have a choice. Deployment, 100% complete. The servers fell silent. Across the world, predictive algorithms began producing nonsense. Threat scores randomized, watch lists dissolved into white noise. The ghost was dying. Rains closed his eyes. It's done. Epilogue. The after. 3 days later, predictive policing systems across the United States began producing nonsensical results. FBI watch lists flagged sitting senators. DHS border algorithms recommended expedited processing for known traffickers. Local police software predicted crimes in empty parking lots. Analysts scrambled to diagnose the problem, but the corruption was too deep, too widespread. Every system touched by Phoenix-derived code, and that was nearly everything, was collapsing into statistical white noise. Emergency meetings were convened, think tanks were consulted. Nobody could explain what was happening, except a few people who knew. Michael Rains spent 2 weeks in a Vietnamese hospital before disappearing again. The last confirmed sighting placed him in a monastery in northern Thailand, where he'd reportedly taken up meditation and carpentry. Lena Ortiz was quietly reinstated at DHS after Vance was forced into early retirement, following an internal investigation. She now headed a task force rebuilding threat assessment systems from scratch, this time with full algorithmic transparency and congressional oversight. The documentation Rains had compiled was never released publicly. Instead, it was sealed in a congressional archive with a 50-year classification. Insurance against Phoenix's resurrection, but protection against the chaos of full exposure. Some ghosts, Lena decided, were better buried than exorcised. 6 months after the servers went dark, she received an anonymous postcard from Thailand. On the front was a photograph of a peaceful temple at sunset. On the back, in neat handwriting, were 4 words, "The ghost is free." She smiled, placed the postcard in a drawer and went back to work. There were other systems to audit, other algorithms to question. The fight wasn't over, it never would be, but for now at least, one ghost had been laid to rest. Final transmission. Classified memorandum from Congressional Intelligence Oversight Committee to Executive Intelligence Review. Date April 15th, 2026. RE Phoenix Program Legacy Systems. Final report. Following comprehensive investigation of the October 2025 predictive system failures, this committee concludes that the Phoenix-derived algorithms were fundamentally flawed and subject to cascading corruption. All affected systems have been decommissioned. Replacement systems are under development with mandatory algorithmic auditing, bias testing and congressional review. The original Phoenix program documentation has been sealed under national security classification for 50 years. Any attempt to rebuild Phoenix-derived systems without explicit congressional authorization is hereby prohibited. 1 casualty was reported during the investigation. Director Marcus Vance, retired, who died of apparent suicide on March 3rd, 2026. A note found at the scene read, "The machine was supposed to save us." Investigation closed. Classification top secret. And somewhere in Southeast Asia, an old man watched the sun set over a world that had finally stopped hunting him. A world where the machines had learned to forget, and where the future belonged to the living, not the dead. Michael Raines closed his eyes and for the first time in 54 years allowed himself to sleep without nightmares. The algorithm was silent, the index was empty, and the ghosts at last were gone. But Raines knew the truth that Lena was just beginning to understand. Ghosts never truly die. They just wait. And somewhere, in some classified lab, in some think tank's basement, in some ambitious programmer's imagination, Phoenix would be born again. Because humans never learn. They only forget. And then they rebuild. The cycle would continue. But not today. Today the world was free. And that, Raines thought, as sleep finally claimed him, was enough. Before we begin, I want to give a thank you to Beeblebrox and so many others who suggested this topic. Your ideas fuel these investigations into the shadows of history. If you have suggestions for future videos, drop them in the comments below. We read every single one. What if I told you that the last mission to the moon wasn't Apollo 17? What if 3 astronauts launched in secret, travelled 250,000 miles into the void, and discovered something that fundamentally changed humanity's relationship with space exploration? What if their names were erased, their families silenced, and their discovery buried under layers of classification that remain sealed to this day? This is the story of Apollo 18, the mission that officially never happened, but unofficially changed everything. The year was 1970, and America's love affair with the moon was dying. Apollo 13 had nearly ended in tragedy that April. Commander James Lovell, Command Module pilot Jack Swigert, and Lunar Module pilot Fred Hayes had survived an oxygen tank explosion 200,000 miles from home through sheer ingenuity and luck. The nation had held its breath for 4 days, glued to their television sets, watching 3 men fight their way back from the edge of the abyss. They made it. But the close call had rattled Congress. By September 1970, NASA Administrator Thomas Paine stood before the Senate Appropriations Committee with grim news. The remaining Apollo missions, 18, 19 and 20, were being cancelled. Budget constraints, shifting priorities and waning public interest had sealed their fate. The moon program that had captivated the world was ending, not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic whimper. Or so the public was told. Behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding. In the basement archives of the Johnson Space Center, there exists a document that most people will never see. It's labelled NASA SP4029, a dry budget reconciliation report from fiscal year 1971. Most of it contains exactly what you'd expect. Columns of numbers, departmental allocations, contractor payments. But on page 247, there's an anomaly. 3 line items totaling $287 million are listed under Specialized Systems Transfer Classified Program Support. The receiving account is identified only by a code, LB73DOD, Liberty Bell. Project Liberty Bell was a joint Department of Defense and NASA initiative, supervised by 2 organizations that rarely appear in public documents, the Office of Space Science and Applications and the National Reconnaissance Office. The NRO, for those unfamiliar, is America's spy satellite agency, so secret that its very existence wasn't officially acknowledged until 1992. What would NASA and America's most classified intelligence agency want with nearly $300 million and a cancelled moon mission? The answer lay in the Cold War's most dangerous game, nuclear detection. Throughout the early 1970s, American intelligence analysts were desperate to monitor Soviet nuclear testing. Satellite surveillance helped, but seismic detection remained the gold standard for identifying underground detonations. The problem was geography. Soviet test sites in Kazakhstan and Novaya Zemlya were geologically shielded, making detection difficult from Earth-based sensors. But what about sensors that weren't on Earth? The moon offered a unique advantage. Its stable, airless environment and low seismic noise made it an ideal platform for detecting faint vibrations across vast distances. More importantly, the moon's orbit around Earth meant that sensors could monitor Soviet territory during windows, when traditional surveillance was blind. Project Liberty Bell's mission was simple. Place advanced seismic relay equipment on the lunar surface, disguised as abandoned Apollo hardware, and use it to monitor Soviet nuclear activity. They would need a crew, 3 men willing to risk everything for a mission that could never be acknowledged. Commander Richard Anderson had been the backup pilot for Apollo 16. At 41, he was older than most astronauts, a Korean War veteran with silver temples, and the kind of steady calm that made younger pilots defer to him without question. He'd spent 2 years training for a moon landing that never came, watching as younger crews got the glory while he remained earthbound. When a 2-star general from the Department of Defense showed up at his Houston office in March 1973 with a manila folder marked Eyes Only, Anderson didn't hesitate. He was being offered what every astronaut dreams of, a mission to the moon. The fact that it was classified only made it more appealing. James Hall was different. A former Air Force test pilot, Hall had been assigned to the Manned Orbital Laboratory, the Air Force's secret space station program, before it was cancelled in 1969. He was 38, dark-haired, intense, with the kind of technical precision that made him NASA's go-to pilot for experimental systems. Hall had grown up reading Tom Swift novels and watching Flash Gordon serials. He joined the Air Force specifically to fly higher and faster than anyone else. When NASA recruited him after MOL's cancellation, he jumped at the chance. Hall was the command module pilot responsible for keeping the spacecraft alive while his crewmates descended to the surface. The 3rd crew member was Marcus Kell, and he was an outsider. Kell wasn't military. He was a civilian geologist from the United States Geological Survey's Astrogeology Center in Flagstaff, Arizona. At 35, he'd spent a decade mapping lunar terrain from photographs, preparing traverse routes for astronauts who would walk on a stone he'd only studied from afar. Kell was wiry, intense, with thick-framed glasses and a habit of speaking in rapid-fire technical jargon that left his colleagues scrambling to keep up. NASA needed a geologist who could identify the best locations for seismic equipment and collect samples that would justify the mission's scientific cover story. Kell was brilliant, obsessive, and, crucially, unmarried with no children. His disappearance, if necessary, would cause minimal civilian disruption. The crew trained in isolation at a classified facility in Nevada, using equipment labelled as Skylab backup hardware. They studied maps of Mare Moscoviense, a far-side lunar basin that would provide their equipment with an unobstructed view of Soviet territory. They practiced deploying sensor packages disguised as standard Apollo science experiments, and they were briefed on what to do if they found something unexpected. Unlikely, the briefing officer had said, a CIA analyst whose name none of them caught. But the Soviets have had multiple lunar probes in the region. If you encounter any foreign hardware, photograph it, catalogue it, and bring back samples if possible. Do not attempt to interact with it directly. Anderson had raised an eyebrow. What kind of samples? The analyst's expression hadn't changed. Anything unusual. Anything that doesn't match baseline lunar geology. Anything that appears manufactured or processed. You think the Soviets built something up there? We think it's prudent to be prepared for any scenario. That should have been the first warning. Launch Complex 39B at Kennedy Space Center had seen better days. By December 1973, it had been more than a year since the last Saturn V had thundered skyward, carrying Apollo 17. The massive gantry stood silent, a rusting monument to a program that had conquered the moon, and then simply stopped. Tourists visiting the Space Center were told that 39B was being reconfigured for Skylab support operations. A plausible enough story, given that America's space station was still operational. What the tourists didn't see was the nighttime activity. Starting in November, unmarked trucks began arriving after dark, delivering components wrapped in protective shrouding. The vehicle assembly building's high bay doors would open just long enough to admit the cargo, then seal shut. Armed Air Force security police established a perimeter that extended far beyond the normal restricted zone. On the morning of December the 7th, 1973, NASA issued a press release announcing a systems compatibility test for Skylab backup hardware, scheduled for December 11th. The test would use vehicle SA-515, one of the unused Saturn V rockets, to verify orbital insertion procedures for potential future space station missions. It was a lie wrapped in technical jargon, and it worked perfectly. SA-515 was real. It had been constructed but never assigned to a mission. The Skylab story was plausible enough that the handful of space journalists who still covered NASA didn't dig deeper, and the December timing was deliberate. The Soviet Union's tracking stations would be focused on their own Soyuz 13 mission, currently in orbit. The crew arrived at the operations and checkout building at 0300 hours on December 11th. They'd spent the previous week in medical quarantine, officially to prevent any illness that might compromise the test flight, unofficially to prevent them from talking to anyone outside the mission loop. Anderson remembered the walk to the transfer van. The air was warm and humid, typical for Florida in December, carrying the salt smell of the Atlantic. Above them, stars blazed in a moonless sky. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were about to fly to the moon on a night when the moon itself was new, invisible from Earth. The suit technicians worked in silence, checking seals and connections with the efficient precision of people who'd done this dozens of times. But there were differences. The mission patches on their suits bore no designation, just the NASA logo. Their names weren't embroidered on the chest, just their surnames and a cryptic alphanumeric: Anderson's D73, Hall SD73, Kell's D73, SD73, Silent Dawn 1973. The elevator ride to the White Room seemed to take forever. Anderson's heart rate was elevated. He could hear it in his helmet's biomedical sensors, but steady. Hall was actually calmer than during simulations, his vital signs rock solid. Kell predictably was running hot, excitement overriding any nervousness. At 0522 hours, the crew entered the command module. They'd named it Endeavour, after Captain Cook's ship of exploration. The lunar module, still folded in the adapter below them, was Orpheus, the Greek hero who descended into the underworld and almost made it back. Another name that should have been a warning. The launch was textbook perfect. At 0631 hours, the Saturn V's 5 F1 engines ignited in a carefully sequenced cascade, producing £7.5 million of thrust. The flame trench beneath the pad redirected the exhaust in a searing river of fire. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the rocket strained against the hold-down arms, every component vibrating with barely contained violence. Then the arms released and Apollo 18 began to rise. Inside the command module, the crew was slammed into their seats by acceleration that built from 1G to 4Gs in a matter of seconds. The rocket's roar was so loud it transcended sound, becoming something physical, a pressure that invaded their bones. Outside the windows, the gantry dropped away with startling speed, replaced by sky transitioning from black to dark blue to brilliant azure. 2 minutes and 42 seconds after liftoff, the first stage separated, its fuel exhausted. The sudden change from brutal acceleration to relative weightlessness made Anderson's stomach lurch, but he kept his focus on the instruments. The second stage ignited smoothly, pushing them higher and faster. 11 minutes after leaving Earth, they were in orbit. The official NASA tracking data for December 11th, 1973 shows only routine Skylab telemetry. There's no mention of a Saturn V launch, no tracking data for a translunar injection burn, no acknowledgement that 3 men had just begun a 250,000-mile journey. But NORAD knew. Their radar installations had tracked every second of the ascent. The data was immediately classified, rerouted to a Department of Defense server that would remain sealed for decades. At mission elapsed time 2 hours, 44 minutes and 16 seconds, while passing over the Pacific Ocean on their second orbit, Endeavour's service propulsion system engine ignited for the translunar injection burn. For 5 minutes and 48 seconds, the engine pushed them faster and faster until they'd exceeded Earth's escape velocity. They were committed now, the moon or nothing. The 3-day coast to lunar orbit was simultaneously routine and surreal. They performed the usual systems checks, verified course corrections, practiced lunar module procedures. But there was no television coverage, no interviews with Walter Cronkite, no excited updates from Mission Control played on every radio station in America. Just them, alone in the void, following a trajectory that officially didn't exist. Flight Director Glyn Lunny oversaw the mission from a specially secured control room at Johnson Space Center. Lunny was a veteran of every Apollo mission since Apollo 7, a brilliant, unflappable leader who'd guided Apollo 13 home when disaster struck. If anyone could be trusted with the most classified mission in NASA's history, it was Lunny. But even Lunny wasn't prepared for what came next. Apollo 18 entered lunar orbit on December the 9th, 1973, at 17:23 mission elapsed time. The lunar orbit insertion burn was perfect, placing them in a 60 by 170 mile elliptical orbit that would be circularized before the landing attempt. Through their windows, the moon's surface scrolled past in stark blacks and greys, utterly lifeless, utterly alien. All remained in Endeavour while Anderson and Kell transferred into Orpheus, the lunar module that would take them to the surface. The undocking went smoothly, and Orpheus began its descent toward Mare Moscoviense. Mare Moscoviense, the Sea of Moscow, is one of the moon's most distinctive farside features. Unlike the familiar Maria visible from Earth, this impact basin is relatively small, only 270 miles across. But it contains unusual magnetic anomalies that had puzzled scientists for years. The mission planners had chosen it precisely because those anomalies might mask the electronic signatures of the surveillance equipment. What they didn't know was that the anomalies had a different source entirely. Orpheus touched down at 23:41 mission elapsed time, landing near the basin's southern rim where magnetic readings were strongest. Anderson's voice was steady as he reported, "Houston, Orpheus. The Eagle has landed." A deliberate echo of Armstrong's famous words. a private acknowledgement of the legacy they carried. "Copy that, Orpheus," came Lunny's response, his voice encrypted and relayed through a satellite network that bore no official connection to NASA. "You're go for EVA in 6 hours. Get some rest." But Anderson was staring out the window at something that didn't make sense. The landing site briefings had shown a relatively smooth area of mare basalt, perfect for deploying equipment. What he saw instead was irregular. The regolith, the dusty lunar soil, showed patterns. Not natural wind patterns, obviously, since the moon has no atmosphere, but linear features, geometric arrangements that looked almost like... "Houston, we have some unusual surface characteristics here," Anderson transmitted. "Request permission to move EVA-1 up to 0300 MET. A long pause, then... "Negative, Orpheus. Stick to the timeline. You need rest." Anderson exchanged a glance with Kell through their helmets. The geologist's eyes were wide behind his visor, fixed on the same patterns Anderson had noticed. "Copy that, Houston," Anderson said. But he knew neither of them would sleep. 4 hours later, they were suiting up anyway. The first EVAs officially began at 3:17 mission elapsed time. Anderson descended the ladder first, pausing on the bottom rung to deliver the words he'd rehearsed 100 times. "I step onto this ancient surface in the spirit of discovery and in the service of my country. No poetry, no giant leap for mankind." This was a military operation, and his words reflected that. Kell followed, immediately setting up the camera that would document their activities. Unlike previous Apollo missions, this footage would never be broadcast, but it needed to exist for post-mission analysis. They worked efficiently, deploying the seismic equipment packages with the practiced precision of countless simulations. The equipment looked identical to the ALS-EP science packages from earlier missions, but these units contained classified sensors designed to detect specific frequencies associated with nuclear detonations. It was while planting the third sensor array that Kell's voice cut across the radio, sharp with surprise. "Commander, you need to see this." Anderson bounded over in the lunar gravity's lazy arc. Kell was kneeling, or as close to kneeling as the suit allowed, next to an outcrop of rock that protruded from the regolith at an odd angle. "What am I looking at?" Anderson asked. Kell reached out with a gloved hand, brushing dust away from the rock's surface. Except it wasn't rock. The surface was metallic, not meteoritic iron, which Anderson had seen in photographs from previous missions. This was processed metal, showing what looked like machining marks, precise angles that didn't occur in nature. "Houston," Kell transmitted, his voice carefully controlled despite the excitement Anderson could hear underneath. "Surface sample at Station 3 shows unusual characteristics. Structure appears engineered, not geological. Recommend immediate sample collection and detailed photography." The response from Houston was immediate. "Say again, Orpheus. Did you say engineered?" "Affirmative, Houston. The sample shows evidence of the transmission cut out, not static, not interference, just silence." Anderson checked his radio. All lights green. He could hear Kell's breathing on the short-range suit-to-suit frequency. But Houston was gone. Then Kell's hand shot out, gripping Anderson's arm hard enough that he felt it through the suit's layers. "Commander," Kell whispered, even though there was no one to overhear in the moon's vacuum. "It's warm." That was impossible. The lunar surface temperature in sunlight reaches 260 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to cook you in an unprotected suit. In shadow, it plunges to minus 280. But objects don't generate their own heat, not naturally. Anderson placed his own glove against the metal surface. Through the suit's insulation, he shouldn't have felt anything. But Kell was right. There was heat. Not scorching, but present. Unmistakable. Active. "We need to document this," Anderson said, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Full photography, spectroscopy if we can get readings. Then we collect samples and..." Kell wasn't listening. He'd moved around the outcrop, brushing away more regolith, revealing more of the structure beneath. It was massive. What they'd seen was just the tip, the exposed edge of something that extended down into the lunar surface. And now that Anderson's eyes had adjusted, he could see that the patterns in the regolith weren't random. They radiated out from this central point, like ripples in a pond, or like something had disturbed the dust when it powered up. Anderson's training took over. Document. Analyze. Report. He began photographing the structure from multiple angles, while Kell used the portable X-ray fluorescence spectrometer to analyze the metal's composition. The readings made no sense. The XRF showed titanium, but not any titanium alloy in their reference database. The crystalline structure was too regular, too perfect. Whatever this was, it hadn't been formed by natural processes. Orpheus, this is Houston. Do you copy? The transmission crackled back to life and Anderson nearly jumped. Houston, Orpheus, we copy. We experienced a 14-minute communication dropout. Negative, Orpheus. We show continuous telemetry. Your biomedical readouts went offline for 14 minutes, but voice communication remained nominal from our end. Anderson and Kell exchanged another look. They'd been shouting at Houston for 14 minutes with no response. Houston claimed they'd maintained contact the whole time. Someone was lying, or something had interfered with the transmission in a way that affected both ends differently. Houston, we have a situation here. We've uncovered what appears to be an artificial structure, possibly Soviet in origin, showing Orpheus, cease that work immediately. A new voice, not Lunny, harder, military. You are to collect the minimum required samples, photograph the area, and return to the LM immediately. Do you understand? Anderson felt something cold settle in his chest. Houston, we need more time to properly document. Orpheus, that is a direct order. Return to the lunar module. Now! The voice left no room for argument. They collected samples. 6 core tubes, each carefully sealed and labelled. Kell wanted to take more, to excavate deeper, to really understand what they'd found. Anderson had to physically pull him away. The climb back up the ladder felt wrong. They were leaving something behind, something that rewrote everything humanity thought it knew about the moon, and they were just walking away. Inside Orpheus, they pressurized the cabin and removed their helmets. Kell's face was flushed, his eyes bright with excitement and frustration. We found something, he said. Something that proves we're not alone. And they're ordering us to follow orders, Anderson interrupted. We're military personnel on a classified mission. We document, we report, we let the analysts make the calls. But nothing. We've got the samples, we've got photographs, we've done our job. Anderson began the post-EVA system check, his hands moving through the familiar routine while his mind raced. What had they found? Soviet equipment was the obvious answer, but the heat signature didn't fit. The Soviets had landed lunar probes in the region, but those were automated samplers, not powered installations, and the metal composition was wrong for Soviet manufacturing, which left possibilities that Anderson didn't want to think about. The return to orbit was scheduled for 16 hours later, giving them time to rest and prepare, but neither man could sleep. They sat in the cramped cabin, occasionally glancing at the sample containers, each lost in their own thoughts. It was Kell who finally broke the silence. What if it's not Soviet? Anderson didn't answer. Think about it. The magnetic anomalies in this region have been documented since the early orbital surveys. That's decades before either us or the Soviets had the capability to land anything here. What if those anomalies weren't natural? What if they were marking something? Marking what? Kell met his eyes. I don't know, but whatever that structure is, it's old. Really old. The regolith accumulation around it suggests it's been here for millennia, maybe longer. Nothing human built that. The words hung in the cabin like a physical presence. Before Anderson could respond, the radio crackled. Orpheus, Houston. We're showing an anomalous reading from your cabin environmental system. Confirm pressure holding steady. Anderson checked the gauges. Everything nominal. Houston, we show all systems green. Pressure is... He stopped. The cabin pressure gauge was dropping. Not rapidly, but definitely dropping. We have a leak, he said, his voice flat with the kind of calm that comes from years of training for disasters. Rate is approximately 0.3 psi per minute. Beginning emergency leak check procedures. They work systematically, checking every seal, every valve, every fitting. The leak wasn't in any of the obvious places, and the rate was increasing. Kell found it first. The primary hatch seal, which had been perfect before EVA, now showed signs of degradation. The rubber gasket looked corroded, eaten away by something. Houston, we found the leak source. Primary hatch seal shows unexpected deterioration. We're going to need to execute early ascent before we lose too much atmosphere. Another new voice from Houston, this one with a slight Texas accent. Orpheus, this is Flight Surgeon. Your biomedical readouts are showing elevated heart rates and core temperatures. Are you experiencing any unusual symptoms? Dizziness, nausea, visual disturbances? Anderson did a mental inventory. He felt fine. Anxious certainly, but that was justified given their situation. Negative, Houston. We feel nominal. Copy that, Orpheus. Be advised, we're seeing markers in your blood chemistry that weren't present pre-EVA. We'll need detailed post-flight medical analysis. Something in the samples, Anderson thought. Something from the structure. It had gotten into their suits, into their gloves. Microscopic particles that were now in the cabin with them. Houston, request immediate return to orbit. We need to rendezvous with Endeavour as soon as possible. Copy, Orpheus. You are go for immediate ascent. Hall is manoeuvring into position now. The launch from the lunar surface was violent and brief. Orpheus's ascent stage engine fired, blasting them away from the descent stage and back toward orbit. Through the window, Anderson caught one last glimpse of the landing site, the disturbed regolith, the exposed structure that was already being buried again by dust their ascent engine had kicked up. Evidence vanishing beneath lunar soil, perhaps never to be seen again. The rendezvous went perfectly. Hall had positioned Endeavour precisely, and the docking was textbook smooth. But when Anderson opened the tunnel between the two spacecraft, Hall immediately sealed his helmet. "Don't come through," Hall said, his voice tight. "Not yet. Jim, we need to transfer the samples and—" "I said not yet." Hall's eyes were hard. "Houston gave me direct orders. You two stay in the LM until we've run full biological protocols." Kell's laugh was bitter. "Biological protocols? We're in a vacuum. There's nothing alive on the moon." "Then you won't mind waiting while we make sure." Hall disappeared from the tunnel, and they heard the hatch seal from Endeavour's side. They were quarantined in space, 250,000 miles from home. The next 6 hours were a nightmare of waiting. Houston ran them through endless medical checks, drawing blood samples using the onboard medical kit, analysing biomarkers for anything unusual. The results kept coming back with the same message: anomalous proteins, unknown compounds, cellular changes that shouldn't be possible. Finally, Hall's voice came through the radio. "Houston is ordering you to jettison the sample containers." "What?" Kell exploded. "No! Those samples are the whole reason we're here. Those samples are contaminated with something that Houston's medical team can't identify. They pose an unacceptable biological risk." Anderson felt something inside him crack. They'd risked everything, found something that rewrote human understanding of the cosmos, and now they were being ordered to throw it into space like radioactive waste. "Houston, this is Commander Anderson. Request clarification. Are you ordering us to destroy evidence of possible extraterrestrial intelligence?" The silence stretched for 15 seconds. Then, "Negative. Orpheus? We're ordering you to protect the Earth from potential contamination. You don't know what you brought back. Neither do we, and we can't risk it reaching the atmosphere. We have containment protocols. The sample containers are sealed." The containers were sealed. Past tense. We're reading chemical changes in the seals similar to what happened to your hatch. Whatever degraded your gaskets is degrading the sample containers. You have maybe 12 hours before those seals fail completely. Kell was staring at the sample containers like they were his children being sentenced to death. "There has to be another way. We could transfer them to Endeavour's storage, use the—" "Negative. All samples are to be jettisoned immediately. That's a direct order from the highest levels of command." Anderson understood then. This wasn't about protecting Earth. This was about protecting a secret. Whatever they'd found, someone had decided it was too dangerous, too destabilizing, too world-changing to ever reach the public. "Commander," Kell said quietly, don't do this." Anderson met his eyes. "I'm sorry." He began opening the sample containers one by one, using the LM's waste disposal chute to vent them into space. Core samples that might have contained proof of ancient intelligence, photographs, spectroscopic data, all of it fed into the void, all except one. While Kell's attention was on the gauges, Anderson palmed one of the smaller containers, a sample of the metallic structure itself. He tucked it into a maintenance access panel, a space meant for tools that would never be inspected during post-flight analysis. If they were going to bury this, at least one piece of evidence would survive. The transfer to Endeavour finally happened 18 hours after docking. By then, both Anderson and Kell were exhausted, their suits contaminated, their bodies showing increasingly unusual biomarker readings that Houston's doctors couldn't explain. Hall had set up a makeshift containment barrier using plastic sheeting and duct tape, separating the cabin into clean and contaminated zones. It was absurd, primitive, and probably ineffective, but it was all they had. The trans-Earth injection burn was scheduled for 36 hours after landing, giving them time to rest and prepare for the journey home. But Anderson couldn't rest. Every time he closed his eyes he saw that structure, that impossible architecture buried beneath lunar dust. And he heard the sound. It had been so faint during EVA that he'd dismissed it as radio interference. But now, in the quiet of the command module, he realised what it was. A vibration, subsonic, barely on the edge of perception. It came from the direction of Mare Muscovians, cycling at regular intervals. A heartbeat. Something on the moon had a heartbeat. "Houston," he transmitted. "Request permission to conduct extended orbital survey of the landing site region before TEI burn." "Negative, Orpheus. You're to execute TEI on schedule and return to Earth immediately." "Houston, we're detecting unusual." "Orpheus." The voice was hard, final. "This conversation is over. Execute TEI on schedule, or we will be forced to conclude that you are medically unfit for command. Do you understand?" It was a threat. Refuse, and they'd declare him incompetent, remove him from command, potentially send Hall back alone, while Anderson and Kell were left in orbit to die. "Copy, Houston. We'll execute TEI on schedule." The burn went perfectly. Endeavour's service propulsion system fired for exactly 2 minutes and 33 seconds, accelerating them out of lunar orbit and onto a trajectory that would bring them home in 3 days. As the moon shrank in their rear window, Anderson saw Hall staring back at it with an expression he couldn't quite read. Regret? Fear? Wonder? "We should have stayed," Hall said quietly. "We should have refused the order and stayed to figure out what that thing was." "We'd be dead in a week," Anderson replied. "No resupply, no rescue mission. NASA would just say we never launched." "Maybe." Hall turned away from the window. "Or maybe we'd have learned something worth dying for." The re-entry was routine until it wasn't. They'd separated the service module and positioned the command module heat shield forward, exactly as planned. The entry corridor was perfect, 32 degrees off vertical, threading the needle between burning up from too steep an angle and bouncing off the atmosphere from too shallow. Anderson felt the first hints of deceleration, the gentlest push against his restraints as they kissed the upper atmosphere. Then, stronger. The G-forces built from 1 to 4 to 6, pressing them into their couches. Outside the windows, plasma began to form, a sheath of ionized air that glowed orange, then white, then an eye-searing blue-white that turned the cabin into a furnace. This was the moment when communication cut out, a normal blackout caused by the plasma sheath. It usually lasted about 4 minutes. It lasted 9. When the radio finally crackled back to life, the voice that came through wasn't mission control in Houston. It was a different frequency, a different operator. "Endeavour, this is USS New Orleans. Do you copy?" The New Orleans. Anderson knew that ship. It had recovered Apollo 14 in 1971, back when recovery operations were public events, covered by every news outlet in the country. "New Orleans, Endeavour, we copy. What's our position?" "You're approximately 600 miles east of projected landing zone. We're vectoring to your position now. ETA 90 minutes. 600 miles off course." That was impossible. Their navigation had been perfect, their trajectory dead on. Unless someone had changed the trajectory while they were in blackout. The capsule splashed down hard, slamming into the Pacific swells with enough force to rattle Anderson's teeth. The cabin tilted, rolled, then settled into the stable flotation position, with the heat shield down and the hatch pointing toward the sky. Through the window, Anderson could see a grey Pacific morning, overcast skies, and in the distance the angular silhouette of a Navy recovery ship, approaching at flank speed. But there was something wrong with the ship's profile. It was carrying more than the usual complement of boats and helicopters, and the deck configuration didn't match a standard Apollo recovery setup. Endeavour, remain in the capsule. Do not, repeat, do not open the hatch. Recovery swimmers are approaching with biological containment protocols. Hall's voice was tight. Biological containment. What the hell is going on? Anderson already knew. Someone had decided they were contaminated. Not just their suits, not just the samples. Them. The swimmers arrived wearing full hazmat suits, not the normal wetsuits of recovery teams. They attached a flotation collar to the capsule, then spent 30 minutes rigging what looked like a flexible containment tunnel from the hatch to a boat alongside. "Gentlemen," came a new voice, calm and clinical. "I'm Colonel Matthews, biomedical officer for this recovery operation. You're going to open the hatch, proceed through the containment tunnel, and board the boat. Do not remove your flight suits. Do not touch any of the recovery personnel. Is that understood?" "Understood," Anderson replied, because there was no point in arguing. The transfer was surreal. They shuffled through a plastic tunnel that swayed with every wave, climbed into a boat where personnel in hazmat suits directed them to sealed benches, then rowed in silence to the New Orleans. The ship had been modified. An entire section of the deck had been enclosed with plastic sheeting and negative pressure ventilation units. They were led through multiple decontamination chambers, each one more thorough than the last. Showers, chemical rinses, medical examinations that lasted hours. Finally, they were placed in isolation chambers, essentially hospital rooms sealed behind airlocks. They could see each other through thick glass windows, but they couldn't talk, couldn't touch, couldn't share the experience of what they'd witnessed. Anderson spent 3 days in that room before the visit started. Men in suits. No names, no badges, just folders full of documents that needed signatures. Non-disclosure agreements, medical waivers, legal instruments that essentially erased Apollo 18 from history. "Your families have been notified of a training accident," one of the suits explained. His voice was flat, bureaucratic. "You'll be listed as killed in a helicopter crash at Ellington Field. There will be closed casket funerals. Your wives will receive full benefits and pensions." "We're not dead," Anderson said. "Officially you are. Unofficially you'll be relocated, given new identities, and placed under permanent monitoring. What you found on the moon remains classified under national security protocols that supersede any oath you've ever taken." Kell, in the next chamber, was pounding on the glass. Anderson could see his mouth moving, forming words that were probably profane. Hall just sat on his bed, staring at nothing. "What about the samples?" Anderson asked. "What did your analysis show?" The suit's expression didn't change. There were no samples. The mission never happened. You were never on the moon. But Anderson had hidden one sample. He knew they'd find it eventually. They'd tear apart every inch of the command module during the accident investigation. But maybe it would buy enough time for someone to study it, to understand what they'd found. He was wrong. 2 weeks later, the isolation ended. Not because they were cleared, but because the decision had been made. Anderson was taken to a debriefing room where a 3-star general he didn't recognise sat across a metal table. "The capsule burned during recovery," the general said. "Onboard fire, very tragic. All physical evidence was destroyed. The descent stage on the moon will be listed in records as Apollo 17 hardware. Any lunar reconnaissance that spots it will be explained as a mapping error. You can't erase what we saw. We can. We have. And we will." The general slid a folder across the table. "These are your new lives. Study them. Become them. Because if you ever speak about Apollo 18 to anyone, your families, your friends, a priest, a journalist, anyone, you'll disappear. Not into isolation, not into prison. You'll just disappear. Are we clear?" They were clear. Richard Anderson became Robert Andrews, a civil engineering consultant in Seattle. He never remarried. He spent his evenings in a small apartment overlooking Puget Sound, watching the moon rise over the water and remembering what it felt like to stand on that ancient surface. James Hall became John Henderson, a flight instructor in Arizona. He taught teenagers to fly Cessnas and tried not to think about the spacecraft he'd piloted through the void. Marcus Kell became Martin Cole, a high school science teacher in Maine. He taught geology to bored sophomores and died a little inside every time they asked if anyone had ever found evidence of life beyond Earth. They never saw each other again. The agencies made sure of that. But they weren't the only ones who knew. In 1981, a NASA technician named Eldon Nichols was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. He was 82 years old, a veteran of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, and he'd been present at Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii when the Apollo 18 crew was brought ashore. Before he died, Nichols gave an interview to a freelance journalist named Patricia Morrison. The interview was never published. Morrison's editor killed the story, her notes mysteriously disappeared from her apartment, and she received a visit from two men who strongly suggested she find a different career. But Morrison remembered what Nichols had told her. He'd seen biological containment canisters being loaded onto a C-141 Starlifter, military personnel in full hazmat suits, and one canister marked with stenciled letters, Lunar Origin. Viable. Something living. Something they'd brought back from the moon. Morrison spent the next decade trying to verify Nichols' story. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests that were denied. She tracked down other technicians who'd been at Hickam, but they all claimed ignorance or refused to talk. She even tried to locate the crew of Apollo 18, but their records had been scrubbed so thoroughly it was as if they'd never existed. She died in 1994 in a car accident that police ruled mechanical failure. Her research materials were never found. In 2009, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter began mapping the moon's surface in unprecedented detail. The images were released to the public, allowing anyone with an internet connection to explore humanity's ancient footsteps on another world. A graduate student at MIT named David Chen was studying images of Mare Moscoviense when he noticed something unusual. Debris patterns that didn't match any documented landing site. Geometric arrangements in the regolith that suggested a descent stage, but in a location where no Apollo mission had officially landed. Chen published his findings in a small astronomy journal. The article got 17 views before the journal's website crashed. When it came back online 3 days later, the article was gone. Chen's faculty advisor suggested he focus on different research for his dissertation, but Chen had made copies. He shared them on forums, sent them to other researchers, uploaded them to file-sharing sites. The images kept disappearing, accounts got suspended, websites went offline, someone was watching, someone was listening. Robert Andrews died in 2019, at the age of 87. Heart failure, the death certificate said. Peaceful, in his sleep. His apartment was cleaned out by a professional service hired by the government. Most of his possessions were unremarkable. Books, furniture, the accumulated debris of a quiet life. But in a drawer hidden behind a false panel in his desk, they found a journal. The journal was confiscated immediately, classified, and locked away in a facility that doesn't appear on any map. But Andrews had been careful. He'd made a copy, sealed it in a waterproof container, and buried it in a public park in Seattle, with coordinates encoded in a letter he'd sent to his estranged daughter years before. She found it in 2023 after finally deciphering her father's cryptic final message. She read about Apollo 18, about the structure on the moon, about the cover-up that had stolen her father's identity and his life. She tried to go public. The story was picked up by a few conspiracy websites, dismissed as elaborate fiction, and quickly forgotten in the endless churn of internet content. But someone else was paying attention. In October 2024, a private lunar communications satellite detected an anomalous signal emanating from Mare Moscoviense. The signal was faint, barely distinguishable from background radiation, but it was there, and it was repeating. The satellite's operators ran the signal through enhancement algorithms, filtering out noise, amplifying the coherent patterns. What emerged made them contact NASA immediately. It was a voice, human, male, transmitted on the S-band frequency that Apollo missions had used for communication. NASA's official response was immediate denial, equipment malfunction, atmospheric reflection of old transmissions, radio hobbyists with too much time. But the recording leaked anyway. It always does. The transmission lasted exactly 18 seconds. The voice was calm, almost resigned, distorted by decades of degradation and the interference of space. "This is Commander Richard Anderson, Apollo 18. If anyone receives this, know that we were never alone up here. The structure at Mare Moscoviense is not Soviet. It's not human. It's old, older than our species, older than our civilization, and it's still active. We thought we were explorers, but we were trespassers. Whatever we awakened, it's still watching. It's always been watching. To anyone planning to return to the moon, be careful what you wake up. Anderson out." The recording has been analysed by audio forensics experts. Some claim it's authentic, a genuine transmission from 1973 that somehow got stored in the moon's magnetic field and released decades later. Others insist it's a hoax, an elaborate fake created by conspiracy theorists with access to vintage NASA equipment. NASA refuses to comment beyond their initial denial, but in the sealed archives, in the folders marked Eyes Only, there's a 1974 memo from the National Reconnaissance Office to the President of the United States. The memo is brief, just 3 paragraphs, but the final line reads, "Recommend permanent cessation of crewed lunar exploration. Object designated Artifact 1 remains active and demonstrates awareness of human presence. Further contact inadvisable until we better understand its nature and intentions." The memo is stamped approved. That's why we haven't been back to the moon in over 50 years. Not because of budget constraints or shifting priorities or lack of public interest. We haven't gone back because something is waiting there. Something ancient and patient and utterly incomprehensible. And somewhere in the classified depths of government servers, monitoring systems watch Mare Moscoviense 24 hours a day, waiting for the structure to wake up again. Waiting for the signal that will tell us whether that first contact was a greeting or a warning. In a nursing home in Tucson, Arizona, an 89-year-old flight instructor named John Henderson sits by a window, watching the moon rise over the desert. He hasn't spoken in 3 years. Stroke, the doctors say. But his eyes are clear, and sometimes the nurses catch him staring at the moon with an expression they can't quite identify. Fear, longing, recognition. On clear nights when the moon is full, Henderson's heart rate increases. The monitors beep faster, and sometimes, if you're very quiet, you can hear him whispering the same thing over and over. "It's still warm, it's still warm, it's still warm." No one knows what he means, but somewhere on the moon, in a basin named for a city most people have never seen, something ancient stirs in the dust, waiting, watching. Remembering the day 3 humans came, discovered its existence, and fled back to their distant blue world. Next time, it won't let them leave. What if I told you that the greatest unsolved mystery in American aviation history was never meant to be solved? That the man who vanished into the night sky over Washington state in 1971 wasn't a criminal at all, but a ghost created by the very government that spent decades pretending to hunt him. The story you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about Daniel Cooper. and about who's really watching from the shadows. Act 1. The Vanishing Man. The rain hammered against the windows of the FBI Seattle field office on November the 24th, 1971, as Special Agent Wallace Grant stared at the preliminary report on his desk. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. The words on the page seemed impossible, yet dozens of witnesses confirmed the same thing. A man calling himself Dan Cooper had just hijacked Northwest Orient Flight 305, extorted $200,000 in cash, demanded 4 parachutes, and jumped into the night somewhere over southwestern Washington. Polite, Grant muttered, reading the passenger descriptions. Calm. Methodical. He tapped his pen against the margin notes. Who the hell are you? The telex machine in the corner chattered to life, and Grant crossed the room to tear off the incoming message. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the text. From FA Western Region to FB Seattle Field Office. Crew Flight 305 incident. Military radar blackout window confirmed 2010 to 2047 PST. No visual confirmation of parachute deployment. Search parameters expanded to 200-mile radius. Grant frowned. A radar blackout? That was the first he'd heard of it. He picked up the phone to call the FAA when his supervisor, Bill Rackham, appeared in the doorway. "Put it down, Wallace," Rackham said quietly. "Sir, this telex mentions a radar blackout I wasn't briefed on." "I said put it down." Rackham's voice carried an edge Grant had never heard before. "The case is being transferred to Division 5. You're to compile your notes and hand everything over by 0800 tomorrow. Division 5. Grant felt something cold settle in his chest. Division 5 was domestic counterintelligence. They handled Soviet infiltration, sedition cases, threats to national security. What did they want with a simple skyjacking? "Bill, what's going on?" Rackham moved closer, lowering his voice. "Nothing you need to worry about. This one's above both our pay grades. Just do as you're told and forget about Dan Cooper." But Grant couldn't forget. None of them could. And 54 years later, in a climate-controlled archive room 3,000 miles away, someone was about to discover why. Act 2. The Black File. Eleanor Reed had spent 37 years with the FBI, most of them in the Records Management Division, a job that sounded boring to everyone who asked, and was exactly as boring as it sounded. She'd filed reports, digitised old case files, and watched younger agents climb the ladder while she remained comfortably anonymous in the basement archives. Now, at 62 and 6 months into retirement, she'd been called back for a special project. Digitising the remaining Norjack files, the Bureau's code name for the Dan Cooper investigation. It was simple work, scanning old documents and cross-referencing them in the database, but Eleanor didn't mind. The extra money helped, and there was something oddly satisfying about handling pieces of history. She was 3 weeks into the project when she found it. The file had been misfiled in a box labelled Hijacking Incidents 1968 to 1970, placed between reports on 2 forgotten cases. The folder itself was unremarkable. Standard manila, slightly yellowed with age, but the stamp across the front made Eleanor's pulse quicken. Project Cooper Directive. Eyes only, classification. Top secret authorised personnel only. Eleanor glanced toward the archive room door. She was alone, as usual. The senior archivist wouldn't be back from lunch for another 20 minutes. Her hand hesitated over the folder before curiosity won out. Inside were approximately 40 pages of documents, memos, and handwritten notes. The first page was a summary brief dated November 15th, 1971, 9 days before the hijacking. Memorandum for Division 5, Assistant Director from Special Projects Liaison, Office of Technical Service. Subject, Operation Cooper Directive, Phase 1, Authorization. This is to confirm joint operation authorization between Bureau Division 5 and Central Intelligence Agency Office of Technical Service for the execution of controlled hijack simulation exercise, codenamed Cooper Directive. Objective. Measure public response parameters to civilian aviation threat scenario. Assess media amplification patterns, law enforcement coordination efficiency, and population anxiety metrics over extended timeline. Operational window. November 20th to 30th, 1971, asset designation. Subject D. Cooper. Civilian contract, non-disclosure binding. Scenario. Simulated ransom hijacking. Northwest Orient Airlines. Seattle-Tacoma route controlled variables. Pre-positioned parachutes, inert test models. Marked currency. Sequential serials, CIA counterfeit division. Predetermined egress coordinates. Eleanor read the words 3 times, certain she must be misunderstanding. A controlled simulation. But Dan Cooper was real. Witnesses saw him. The airline confirmed the hijacking. The FBI had searched for months. She turned to the next page. An operational timeline with minute-by-minute checkpoints. Most had neat check marks beside them, but at 2039 PST someone had written in red ink, "Subject deviated from protocol. Deployed personal chute. No radio contact." And below that, in different handwriting, shakier, "Subject did not deploy test chute, took cash and documents. Possible defection. Contain. Documents?" Eleanor flipped through more pages, finding a manifest of items supposedly aboard Flight 305. Most were expected. The money bag, parachutes, fuel calculations. But near the bottom, someone had added a handwritten note. Courier package confirmed sewn into currency bundles. Contents: microfilm archives, Operation Chaos subject files, preliminary Watergate documentation, priority recovery. Eleanor sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Operation Chaos was the CIA's illegal domestic surveillance program, exposed years later during the Church Committee hearings. Watergate documentation, before the break-in was even public knowledge. She photographed every page with her phone, her hands trembling slightly. This wasn't just a cold case file. This was evidence of something far larger, something that powerful people had worked very hard to bury. As she replaced the folder exactly where she'd found it, Eleanor noticed one final detail that made her stomach drop. The last page was a distribution list of everyone who'd received copies of the directive. 14 names. Beside 11 of them, someone had drawn a small red X. And at the bottom, in fresh ink that couldn't be more than a few years old, "Monitoring ongoing, containment protocol active." Eleanor locked the archive room behind her and walked to her car on legs that felt disconnected from her body. She didn't notice the grey sedan that pulled out 3 cars behind her, maintaining a careful distance all the way to her apartment in Silver Spring. Act 3. The Surviving Asset. Thomas Harkins lived in a modest ranch house outside Olympia, Washington, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that blocked most of the sunlight. Eleanor had tracked him down through the operational files. He'd been an airfield technician at McCord Air Force Base in 1971, one of the few names on the distribution list without a red X. When he opened the door, she saw a man who'd aged far beyond his 87 years. His hands shook slightly, and his eyes held the haunted look of someone carrying secrets too heavy to bear alone. "Mr. Harkins, my name is Eleanor Reed. I worked for the FBI Records Division, and I need to ask you about something that happened in November 1971. His face went pale. "You should go. Please. I found the Cooper directive files. I know it was a simulation. I know something went wrong." Harkins gripped the doorframe. "If you found those files, you're already in danger. They don't let people like you just walk away with that kind of knowledge." "Then help me understand what I'm walking away from." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stepped aside. 5 minutes, that's all you get. His living room was sparse, a worn couch, a television, photos of grandchildren on the mantel. Harkins didn't offer her a seat. Instead, he moved to the window and peered through the curtains at the empty street. "I was just a technician," he began, his voice low. 23 years old, fresh out of technical school. In early November, they brought me into a secure hangar and told me I'd been selected for a classified logistics assignment. All I had to do was prepare 4 parachutes according to very specific modifications. What kind of modifications? 2 of them were real, standard military reserve chutes, fully functional. The other 2 were test models, inert. They'd open, but they weren't designed to support a person's weight for more than a few seconds, just long enough to make it look real if anyone happened to spot the drop. Eleanor felt sick. They were going to kill him! No, Harkins shook his head. That's what I thought at first too, but the asset, Cooper, who was supposed to take the inert chutes, he knew which ones they were. The whole plan was for him to jump with an inert chute, deploy it for visual confirmation, then cut away and deploy his personal rig. He'd land at predetermined coordinates where a recovery team was waiting. Clean extraction, controlled environment, perfect psychop to study public response to aviation terror. But he didn't follow the plan. He took the real chutes, and he took something they didn't expect him to take. Harkins returned to the window, his paranoia evident. The money wasn't the prize. Inside the currency bundle sewn into the fabric of the money bag itself was a courier package. Microfilm. Dozens of rolls containing names, addresses and photographs of deep-cover CIA operatives working domestic assignments. People who'd been exposed by intelligence leaks inside the agency. Why would they transport something like that on a civilian flight? Because no one would think to look there. It was supposed to be a quick handoff. Cooper gets the money bag, jumps, recovery team secures the package, case goes into the books as an unsolved mystery. But Cooper realised what he had. Those weren't just names on film. Those were leverage, insurance, proof that the agency was running illegal operations on American soil. He defected. That's one word for it. I'd say he made a business decision. Someone inside the operation tipped him off about what was really in that bag. He grabbed the intel and vanished, and the people who designed the whole thing couldn't exactly file a police report saying their fake hijacker stole their illegal surveillance records. Eleanor pulled out her phone and showed him the photo of the distribution list. 11 of these people are dead, marked with red X's. Harkins barely glanced at it. 12 now. Martin Kellerman died 3 months ago. Heart attack, they said. He was 59 and ran marathons. His jaw tightened. Everyone connected to the directive has been systematically eliminated over the past 2 decades. I'm alive because I was nobody. A technician who prepared parachutes and kept his mouth shut. But you found the file, which means someone made a mistake, and mistakes get corrected. I need to know who's doing the correcting. You're asking the wrong question. You should be asking why they're still correcting mistakes from an operation that's 50 years old. He finally met her eyes. The Cooper case never closed because it was never supposed to close. Think about it. How many unsolved mysteries stay in the public consciousness for half a century? How many trigger thousands of amateur investigations, documentaries, books, conspiracy theories? You're saying the mystery itself is intentional? I'm saying the mystery is the experiment. They wanted to see how long they could keep a story alive through cultural reinforcement. No closure, no resolution, just perpetual speculation. The perfect case study in long-term social engineering. Dan Cooper isn't a person anymore, he's a phenomenon. And someone is still managing that phenomenon. Eleanor's mind reeled. Who? I don't know names. But after I left McCord, I did some digging, found references to something called Operation Horizon Wing, a continuation program funded through discretionary intelligence budgets. Its mandate was behavioural containment following hijack simulation incident. That was in 1973. It's been refined, privatised, and expanded since then. Last I heard, it was being run through a DARPA contractor specialising in psychological operations and narrative control. That's insane. That's classified. He handed her a slip of paper with an address. There's someone who knows more than I do. Greg Larson, investigative journalist, specialises in government transparency cases. If anyone can help you make sense of this, it's him. But Eleanor, understand something. The moment you go public with this, you become a loose thread. And they're very good at trimming loose threads. She tucked the paper into her pocket. Why are you helping me? For the first time, something like a smile crossed his weathered face. Because I'm 87 years old and I'm tired of being afraid. Maybe it's time someone finally cut the strings. Act 4. The Shadow Investigation. Greg Larson worked out of a converted warehouse in Portland's industrial district, surrounded by filing cabinets, conspiracy corkboards, and enough encryption equipment to make the NSA nervous. When Eleanor arrived with her documentation, he spent 3 hours verifying the files before he said a single word. Finally, he sat back and removed his reading glasses. "This is real." "I know. No, I mean this is really real. I've chased government ghosts for 15 years, and most of it's smoke and mirrors. But this?" He gestured at the document spread across his desk. "This is actionable, verifiable, court-admissible evidence of a domestic psyop. Do you understand what you found? I understand that people have died to keep it buried. Then you understand we need to be extremely careful." He pulled up several databases on his computer. "I've been tracking anomalies in the Norjack case for years. There are inconsistencies that never made sense until now." He showed her aerial photographs from 1980, when a young boy found $5,800 of Cooper's ransom money, partially buried along the Columbia River at Bar. The FBI made a big deal about this discovery. They said it proved Cooper died in the jump and the money washed downstream. But look at the serial numbers. Eleanor leaned closer. They matched the currency manifest. Except they shouldn't exist. Greg pulled up another file. "I obtained records from the CIA's Technical Services Division through a FOA request 6 years ago. Buried in thousands of pages of budgetary documentation was a line item for currency reproduction services provided to Fort Belvoir in late 1971. Fort Belvoir is where the Army runs its counterfeit detection and production facility. They made fake bills with the same serial numbers. Test bills, for training purposes, officially. But here's the thing. The money found at Bar was weathered, but not consistently. Some bills showed severe degradation, others were barely affected. That's not how natural exposure works. The weathering was staged. They planted Cooper's money to close the case, to stabilise the narrative. By 1980, the story was getting stale. They needed a development to keep it alive, to make it feel like progress was being made. A small discovery, enough to generate headlines, but not enough to actually solve anything. It's brilliant in a deeply disturbing way. Eleanor felt the pieces aligning in her mind. Harkins mentioned Operation Horizon Wing, a behavioural containment program. Greg's fingers flew across his keyboard. "Let me check something." He accessed what appeared to be a classified database. Eleanor didn't ask how. "Here. Internal CIA memorandum dated April 1973 from Richard Helms to the Director of the Office of Technical Service." The scanned document appeared on screen. R.E. Operation Horizon Wing. Quarterly assessment. Public myth successfully stabilised following subject's unplanned extraction. Media amplification parameters within acceptable ranges. Civilian investigation efforts show predicted patterns of obsessive focus without resolution demand. Recommendation. Continue monitoring cultural reinforcement mechanisms. Maintain periodic evidence discoveries to sustain engagement without closure. Current timeline projects sustained public interest for minimum 25-year cycle. Budget allocation. Approved under discretionary domestic analysis programs. Transition to private contractor oversight recommended by 1985 to minimise institutional liability. 25 years minimum, Eleanor whispered. It's been 54. Because it worked better than they ever imagined. The Cooper legend became self-sustaining. People didn't need the government to keep it alive. They did it themselves. But someone still needs to manage it, to make sure it doesn't drift too far from the useful narrative. Who's managing it now? Greg pulled up a corporate registry. The program was privatised in 1987, transferred to a company called Horizon Analytics, which was later absorbed by Sentinel Cognitive Systems in 2003. Sentinel holds multiple contracts with DARPA's Behavioural Sciences Division. Their specialty is narrative architecture and long-term social pattern analysis. That sounds like Orwellian nightmare fuel. It gets better. Sentinel's CEO is a woman named Patricia Koenig. Want to guess where she worked before going private? CIA, Division 5 of the FBI. She was 17 years old when the Cooper hijacking happened. but by 1983 she was running psychological operations for Bureau Counterintelligence. She has the institutional knowledge, the clearances, and the resources to keep this thing alive indefinitely. Eleanor stood and paced the warehouse floor. So what do? We can't exactly file a police report. We leak it. Not to mainstream media. They're too compromised, too afraid of losing access. We go to independent platforms, multiple sources simultaneously. We flood the zone with documentation before they can contain it. And then we see if the truth can survive contact with the people who've been lying about it for 5 decades. Greg began organising the files. I'll need 48 hours to verify secondary sources and set up dead man switches. If anything happens to either of us, the documentation auto-releases to 24 outlets. You think they'd really kill us over this? He met her eyes with an expression that was almost pitying. Eleanor, they've already killed 11 people. We're just 2 more loose threads. Act 5. The truth buried in plain sight. They worked through the night, building an unassailable case. Greg had contacts in cryptography who verified the document's authenticity. Eleanor cross-referenced names and dates with public records, building timelines that proved the government's narrative had been manufactured from the beginning. By dawn, they had everything ready for release. That's when Greg's phone rang. He checked the screen and frowned. "Unknown number," he answered on speaker. "Larson." The voice that came through was distorted, digitally masked. "Mr. Larson, Miss Reed, you've both been very busy." Eleanor felt ice flood her veins. "You have information that doesn't belong to you," the voice continued. "Information that could cause significant disruption to ongoing research initiatives. We're prepared to offer you a choice. Walk away now, destroy everything you've compiled, and return to your lives with no consequences. Or proceed with your planned disclosure and face legal action for theft of classified materials, conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act, and unauthorized disclosure of national defense information." Greg leaned toward the phone. "Who is this?" "I'm someone who appreciates thoroughness, Mr. Larson. Your investigation has been impressive, but you're missing the larger picture. The Cooper Directive wasn't a mistake or a conspiracy. It was research, valuable research that continues to produce actionable intelligence on social behavioural patterns. You're admitting the government staged a hijacking and has been manipulating the public for 50 years. I'm admitting that understanding how populations process, remember, and mythologize unsolved events is crucial to national security. The Cooper case has provided decades of data on collective memory, conspiracy theory formation, and the relationship between mystery and cultural identity. That research has applications far beyond a single hijacking. It informs counter-terrorism strategy, disinformation detection, and crisis communication protocols." Eleanor found her voice. "People died. 11 people on that distribution list were murdered to protect your research. Natural causes, accidents, and unfortunate timing. You're seeing patterns that don't exist, Miss Reed. Confirmation bias is a powerful thing, as our research has repeatedly demonstrated. Then you won't mind if we publish what we found." A pause. "You'll find that difficult without your documentation." Greg's face went white. He pulled up his encrypted drives. Empty. The cloud backups. Gone. Every file they'd compiled, every photograph Eleanor had taken, wiped clean as if they'd never existed. How? Did you really think we wouldn't notice a retired FBI archivist accessing restricted files? That we wouldn't monitor a journalist with a history of investigating classified programs? You were never in control of this investigation, Mr. Larson. We simply allowed you to believe you were, so we could assess your methodology and identify any other potential security breaches." Eleanor pulled out her phone. The photos were gone. Even the originals, backed up to her personal cloud, deleted. "The files in the archive room," she said desperately. "The Cooper Directive folder was removed from the National Archives 3 days ago and appropriately reclassified. There is no record of its existence. There is no record of this conversation. In approximately 90 seconds, this phone will disconnect and all trace of this call will be erased." "You can't just erase the truth." "Miss Reed, we've been erasing, reshaping and managing truth for longer than you've been alive. The Cooper case is just one of hundreds of ongoing social research programs. Every major unsolved mystery of the past century has been carefully studied for its psychological impact. Some occur naturally, some we engineer. All of them teach us something valuable about human nature. The line crackled with static. 60 seconds. I suggest you both return to your normal lives. Mr. Larson, your next article on municipal corruption will be well received. Miss Reed, enjoy your retirement, but understand, you are now part of our research database. Any future attempts to investigate this matter will be noted and addressed accordingly. Wait, Greg started. The line went dead. They sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Greg immediately tried to verify what the caller had said, checking and rechecking his drives, his backups, his fail-safes. Everything was gone. Not just deleted, erased at a level that suggested direct access to his systems despite multiple layers of encryption. This is impossible, he muttered. I had these files distributed across 6 different networks. They couldn't have accessed all of them. Unless they'd been monitoring from the beginning, Eleanor thought. Unless every move they'd made had been observed, catalogued, and allowed to proceed just far enough to identify any security weaknesses. She walked to the window and stared out at the grey Portland morning. Somewhere in this city, in this country, people were going about their lives completely unaware that their government had spent half a century running psychological experiments on them disguised as unsolved mysteries. They win, she said quietly. No, Greg's voice was firm. They don't get to win. We have no evidence, no files, no proof of anything. If we try to tell this story, we sound like conspiracy theorists. We have nothing. We have our testimony. We have what we saw, what we learned. We can still what? Get dismissed as crazy. Get disappeared. They're monitoring us, Greg. They made that clear. The moment we become more trouble than we're worth, we end up like the other 11 people on that list. He wanted to argue. She could see it in his face, but he knew she was right. They'd lost. Act 6. The final broadcast. Eleanor returned to her apartment that afternoon, feeling hollowed out. The grey sedan was gone. They didn't need to follow her anymore. She was contained, neutralised, no longer a threat. She made tea she didn't drink and sat by the window watching the street below. Normal people doing normal things, unaware that the reality they lived in was being carefully curated by people in windowless rooms who viewed human behaviour as data points to be collected and analysed. The mailbox buzzer startled her from her thoughts. She took the elevator down to the lobby, expecting bills or junk mail. Instead, she found a small padded envelope with no return address, just her name written in block letters. Inside was a USB drive. No note, no explanation, just the drive and a paper label that read, Flight 305, recovered audio. Eleanor's hand shook as she carried it back upstairs. This was a trap, it had to be. They were testing her, seeing if she'd learned her lesson. But she couldn't stop herself from plugging it into her laptop. A single audio file. She clicked play. Static filled her speakers, the harsh crackle of old radio transmission. Then, through the noise, a voice. Ground control, this is Cooper. Confirming egress at designated coordinates. More static. Then a different voice, calm and professional. Negative, Cooper. You're not at designated coordinates. Abort extraction. Repeat, abort extraction and proceed to... Negative, ground control. I'm exactly where I need to be. Cooper, you're in violation of operational protocol. Return to dash dash. Protocol? The voice that had to be Cooper laughed. Let me tell you about protocol. The people you work for just tried to kill me with faulty equipment. The people I work for just tried to buy me with someone else's secrets. I don't work for anyone anymore. Cooper, listen carefully. The cargo you're carrying is classified beyond your clearance level. If you do not return it immediately, you will be designated a hostile asset and what? You'll what exactly? File an official report saying your fake hijacker stole your illegal surveillance files? Tell the FBI that your psychological operation went rogue? I don't think so. A long pause filled with static. Then a third voice. Older. Authoritative. Mr. Cooper. My name is Richard Helms. I believe we should discuss terms. The recording cut out. Eleanor replayed it 3 times, trying to process what she was hearing. But it was the background sound that finally made her pause. Beneath the voices, beneath the static, there was a steady rhythmic hum. Mechanical. Precise. She isolated the background frequencies using audio software and felt her skin crawl. The hum matched the signature of VLF transmissions, very low-frequency radio waves used for communicating with submarines. The technology existed in 1971, but these particular modulation patterns, this specific encryption scheme, weren't developed until the late 1990s. Someone had faked this recording. Recently. But why send it to her? Why now, after they'd wiped all her evidence and warned her to stay silent? Unless this was the next phase of their research. They'd contained the immediate threat, deleted the hard evidence, but now they wanted to see what she'd do with ambiguous information. Would she investigate further? Would she try to verify the audio? Would she learn from her mistakes, or would she keep pulling at threads they'd deliberately left loose? She was still part of their experiment. She'd always been part of it. Eleanor closed her laptop and sat in the gathering darkness of her apartment. Somewhere, analysts were noting her behavioural response, updating their models of how retired FBI archivists process suppressed information. The research never ended. The observation never stopped. She thought about Thomas Harkins living in fear for 50 years, about Greg Larson, whose career investigating government secrets had probably been monitored and guided more than he'd ever know, about Dan Cooper himself, whoever he really was, jumping into the night with secrets that powerful people desperately wanted back. The smart thing to do was delete the audio and forget everything, return to retirement, pretend none of this had happened. But Eleanor had never been particularly smart about knowing when to quit. She copied the audio file to 3 different cloud services using 3 different encryption methods. She sent anonymous copies to 5 journalists she'd never contacted before. She uploaded it to 4 different conspiracy forums using a VPN and burner email addresses. If they wanted her to be part of their research, she'd show them what uncontrolled variables looked like. Within 2 hours, the audio was spreading across the internet. Within 6 hours, major news outlets were reporting on newly surfaced Cooper hijacking audio. Within 12 hours, the FBI had issued a statement calling it a hoax. Eleanor waited for the knock on her door, for the consequences she knew were coming. Instead, she received a text from an unknown number. Interesting choice. Data collection continuing. Thank you for your participation. She stared at the message until her screen went dark. They'd won after all, because even her rebellion was useful to them. Epilogue. The Loop. Present day. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Digital Archives. Case file. NORJAC. DB Cooper investigation. At 3:47 a.m. Eastern Time, the case status updated automatically. Status. Ongoing evaluation. Last modified. Current date modified by DCOPER 71. The change triggered no alarms. The system had been making similar updates every few months for years, each time from the same user account that technically didn't exist in any official database. In Seattle, a cybersecurity researcher noticed the update while doing routine archive scraping for a documentary project. She screenshotted the metadata, intending to write a blog post about government database quirks. Her computer crashed before she could save the file. In Portland, Greg Larson received an email from a source claiming to have new information about the Cooper case. The attached files were encrypted with a key he'd never seen before. When he tried to decrypt them, his entire server farm went offline for 6 hours. When the systems came back up, the email was gone. In Silver Spring, Eleanor Reed woke from a dream she couldn't quite remember. Something about parachutes and static and a voice saying they were never passengers, they were observers. She made coffee and checked the news. The Cooper audio she'd leaked had been thoroughly debunked by experts who had determined it was a digital fabrication created using modern software. The story had already faded from the news cycle, replaced by newer mysteries, fresher conspiracies. She opened her laptop to check her email and found a notification that her FBI pension had been increased by 3%. No explanation, just an automated message thanking her for her years of service. She closed the laptop. Through her window she watched morning commuters rushing to catch buses and trains. Normal people living normal lives. But somewhere in that crowd, she knew there were observers, analysts, People who studied the patterns of daily life and measured how populations responded to the stories they were told. The Cooper case would never be solved because it was never meant to be solved. It was a perpetual experiment in controlled mystery, and she had just proven that even people who knew they were being manipulated couldn't escape the manipulation. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. Newly discovered evidence in Zodiac killer case sparks renewed investigation. Eleanor almost laughed. The cycle never ended. The research continued. And somewhere in a secure facility that didn't appear on any map, analysts were already measuring public response to the latest chapter in another carefully managed unsolved mystery. At SeaTac International Airport, security cameras captured thousands of faces every hour. Most were logged and deleted after 72 hours, lost in the endless stream of travellers moving through the terminal. But at 2:23 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in the present day, a facial recognition algorithm flagged something unusual. A man, tall, approximately 6 feet, dark suit, narrow tie, carrying a vintage briefcase that dated to the early 1970s. The system attempted age regression analysis based on known photographs from the Cooper case, but the man's face was angled away from the camera at precisely the moment that would have provided the clearest image. The only clear shot captured him at the TSA checkpoint, placing his briefcase on the conveyor belt. Just before the metal detector, he turned toward the camera and smiled. The image was flagged for review, assigned a reference number and forwarded to a database that, officially, didn't exist. By the time a human analyst viewed the footage 6 hours later, the man was gone, vanished into the crowds like a ghost who'd never been real to begin with. The analyst made a note in the file, closed the window and returned to monitoring the next unsolved mystery. Somewhere a clock was ticking. Somewhere an experiment was still running. And somewhere a man who might or might not have been Daniel Cooper was smiling at the cameras, knowing that the greatest trick he'd ever pulled was making them think he'd disappeared in the first place. The game wasn't over. It had never really begun.